Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I've never told this to anyone, not to my wife who shared my bed for 23 years, not to my kids, not to the guys at the truck stop. Nobody. But I know it's been eating at me from the inside, and it's not just the scar on my arm. It was a Thursday night in late October, 2018. I was heading south on Interstate 75 through Georgia, coming back empty from a delivery run to Jacksonville. Live cargo chickens, delivered right on schedule. My plan was to catch some sleep at a trusted truck stop near Macon, but I never made it that far. There was this light drizzle, you know, the kind that just fogs up your windshield without actually cleaning anything. The highway was dark, that peculiar kind of darkness where even your high beams seem like they're fighting through wet cloth. Long stretches with no shoulder, minimal lighting. Just me and whatever was coming from the opposite direction, which wasn't much. Then I saw it. First, just a flashing light in the distance. Thought it might be a state trooper. As I got closer, I realized it was hazard lights blinking in the middle of the lane. I started slowing down, approaching carefully. That's when the scene opened up in front of me. There was an 18-wheeler jackknifed sideways across both lanes. In front of it, what was left of a sedan was crushed against the guardrail, compressed like a soda can, smoke rising from the engine bay. And fire, small flames just starting, but growing fast with that hungry look fire gets. On the other side of the highway, 5 or 6 cars had stopped. People were out of their vehicles, but nobody was getting close. There was shouting, crying, cell phones recording, but nobody was moving toward the wreck. I can't explain what came over me. I just threw my rig into the opposing lane, hit the brakes hard, pulled the parking brake, kicked off my boots, grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted by the door, and ran. Ran without thinking, without planning, just moved. The first thing that hit me when I got close was the heat. It burned the air itself. The sound was this hissing mixed with crackling, like the metal was contracting and expanding on its own. I looked inside the car. The driver's seat was empty, but in the back seat there was a woman, unconscious, slumped over at an odd angle. And there was a child, a boy, maybe 9 years old, couldn't have been older. He wasn't crying loudly, he was frozen, his seatbelt somehow twisted around his neck, trying to pull it free with both hands. When he saw me, his eyes just went wide. Didn't say a word, just stared, and that look has stayed with me to this day. The front door wouldn't open. The whole front end was welded to the guardrail by heat and impact. I hammered on it with the fire extinguisher, nothing. Went around to try the back door. That's when I heard a crack, like something had blown in the engine. The flames suddenly surged upward, catching the underside of the dashboard. That smell of burning plastic, you know, sharp and choking, sticks in your nose. I managed to break the rear window with the extinguisher, reached in and pulled the boy out. His seatbelt was tight, but I got it loose, lifted him up, and carried him to safety. When I went back for the woman, I saw that none of those people had moved an inch. This whole thing had taken less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. I ran back for her. She was slumped sideways, her head against the seat back. Alive, I could see her chest rising, but her eyes were closed. The seatbelt was wrapped around her neck and shoulder, jammed like it had locked up after the impact. The fire had already started eating the front carpet, climbing like a hot tongue. And I knew if I waited any longer, it would be impossible. I stuck my head inside the car, wrapped my right arm around her waist, tried to pull. Nothing. The belt was stuck in a way that no amount of force would release it. I tried to reach the release button, but it was melting. That's when I remembered the pocket knife, the one my father gave me before he died. I'd carried it for years in my boot, never thinking I'd use it like this. I pulled it out with my left hand, knelt on the wet asphalt that was already getting warm, shoved half my body into the car with my left arm over the dashboard, and started cutting. But cutting a seatbelt with a pocket knife isn't easy. It's thick fabric, reinforced stitching. The knife was shaking in my hand, smoke pouring into my nose, burning like poison. On the third pass of the blade, I felt a different kind of heat. It was on my arm. I looked over, the flames had touched my sleeve. I should have let go, but I didn't. I kept cutting. The shirt fabric melted into my skin. The smell changed. It wasn't plastic from the engine anymore. It was worse. It was my arm burning, but I didn't let go. The belt finally gave way. She fell to the side, and I grabbed her by the shoulders, pulled her out hard. We both hit the asphalt. I rolled on top of her, tried to put out the fire however I could. There was fire on her clothes too. I beat it with my hands, with my chest, did everything I could. My arm was screaming, but the pain felt like it was coming from somewhere else. When I finally managed to stand up, my arm was already starting to blister, swelling, raw flesh visible under the burned fabric. But all I remember thinking was that she was still breathing. I looked back, the car exploded from the inside. Fire consumed the upholstery. A bright flash shot over the roof. The front left tire melted completely. I was kneeling there, covered in wet mud, reeking of smoke, and something burned. That was me. The sirens arrived right then. First a highway patrol car, then fire trucks and ambulances. All that noise, the road that had been dark and empty, suddenly filled with people stepping in puddles, in debris, in memory. But nobody saw me because I was already throwing up in the bushes, crouched behind my truck, shaking. You know when your body locks up but your head is still there, still seeing everything. That's how it was. I saw the boy hugging a paramedic. I saw the woman conscious on the ground, holding someone's hand, and a state trooper looking in the direction of my truck like he was trying to understand. But I just wanted to get out of there. I got up slowly, climbed into my cab, started the engine. My left hand was shaking so bad I couldn't close the door on the first try. I closed it with my knee and drove away. I didn't stop at any truck stop that night. Drove straight for 4 hours until the adrenaline wore off. The rain got heavier along the way, and the highway became deserted again. It was like everything had returned to normal, except I wasn't whole anymore. My arm was throbbing, not just pain, but a kind of pulsing, like my body was trying to warn me that something inside had crossed a line. I only stopped when I saw a 24-hour pharmacy at a highway interchange in some small town. Went in wearing a baseball cap with my sleeve pulled down to my wrist. Said it was a household burn. Asked for ointment, bandages, whatever they had. The woman looked at me with pity and fear. From there I went straight home. Didn't tell anyone. My wife only saw the bandage a few days later, asked what happened. I told her I'd accidentally touched a hot exhaust pipe. She believed me. The wound took weeks to heal. Skin peeling, flesh trying to mend itself. It healed crooked. I still can't fully straighten my left arm. To this day, if you pay attention, you can see it's slower, more stiff. But what really burned me wasn't the fire. It was what came after. Because nobody looked for me. Nobody thanked me. No news story, no article, no note. At first it seemed strange, but then it was a relief, because I didn't want it either. Didn't want to appear, didn't want anyone to say I was brave. I wasn't brave. I acted on impulse, acted on something inside me that needed to get out. Like that accident was just the trigger for something I'd been carrying for a very long time. When I pulled that woman out of the car, I wasn't saving her. I was trying to save something I already knew couldn't be brought back. You see, there was something else. Something that happened 17 years before that night. Something I've never told anyone, not even my brother when he was alive. His name was Tommy, a year younger than me. We grew up sharing everything: bicycles, shoes, beds, and eventually trucks. Because it was with him that I learned to really drive. The first long haul I ever did was with him. Our father had just died, and we borrowed an uncle's truck to run some loads and keep the bills from piling up too high at home. Tommy was light-hearted, made jokes about everything, could diffuse any tension. One of the few people who could make me really laugh, not just pull the corners of my mouth up, but actually laugh. We were climbing through the mountains in Tennessee with a tight schedule load, and I was behind the wheel. I hadn't slept much, but I didn't say anything. He even suggested we stop. Come on, man, sleep for half an hour. And me, being stubborn, said I could handle just one more stretch. It was a micro-sleep, maybe 4 seconds, maybe less. All I know is when I opened my eyes, we were in the oncoming lane. I tried to get back on track, but the curve was blind and the truck skidded. We rolled twice. I went flying through the windshield. He didn't. Tommy was trapped. When they pulled me from the ground and I looked at what was left of the truck, I saw the stain where he had been. I saw people running, saw someone shaking their head, and I understood immediately. I screamed, but no sound came out. I ended up in the hospital with road rash, cracked ribs, and something inside me that never went back to the right place. I never told my mother what really happened that night, never told anyone. I said it was fate, that the road was wet, that the truck lost power. Lies. I fell asleep. I knew I was exhausted, and I didn't stop. And Tommy paid with his life, because I wanted to prove I could handle more than I could. After that, everything changed. I kept driving, kept trucking, but I never touched a steering wheel again without remembering that accident. I made promises, prayed, tried therapy. Nothing worked. What remained was a wound that doesn't bleed but never closes either. That's why that night on I-75, when I saw the fire, when I saw that boy trapped, when I stuck my body inside that car and stayed there feeling my arm get fried, I wasn't thinking about the present. I was back there. I was trying to compensate, not to save that woman or that boy, but to save Tommy. Like God had given me another chance, like I could pay a debt I know will never be settled. That's why I didn't want anyone to applaud me. That's why I left without giving my name. That's why I carry this burn hidden, like a personal reminder of what I should never have let happen. The truth is, I'm not a hero. I'm the guy who fell asleep at the wheel in 2000, and won and killed the only brother he had. What I did that night on I-75 was just what was left of me trying to make it right. Maybe that's why I keep driving to this day, even with the pain, even when there's no real need, even when life could have stopped long ago. Because every mile is still a way of carrying what's left of me. And my burned, crooked left arm is just my body's way of not forgetting what I did or what I lost. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I know most people carry memories in photographs, in old letters, in jewelry that gets forgotten at the bottom of a drawer. With me, it was different. With me, it was in the urn, and it wasn't my choice at first. It just became part of me because I couldn't leave her anywhere else. My wife's name was Linda. We were together for almost 32 years, and we were never ones to make a big show of emotions. But everything was there, solid. In the way she'd pack my clothes in the suitcase before each haul. In the coffee with just a little sugar because she said I needed to watch my blood pressure. In how she could tell when I was lying about being okay just by the pause I'd take between words. When she got sick, there wasn't time for anything. It started in March. By July, she wasn't talking anymore. By September, she was in the hospital, and by November, she was gone. There wasn't time to process anything. The only thing I remember clearly from that period was the silence inside the house. It felt like time itself had changed texture. At the funeral, I said I didn't want cremation. I said she deserved a beautiful grave with flowers. But then, after a few days alone in the house, something came over me that I can't explain. It wasn't guilt. It was a need not to leave her far away. I went back, talked to the funeral home people. They did the cremation, handed me the sealed urn with a white ribbon around it and a label with her name. I wrapped it in a piece of our bedroom comforter, that light blue one with embroidered flowers that she'd made herself when we still lived in our first trailer in Bakersfield. Since then, I carried the urn in the truck. I didn't tell anyone. It stayed in a space behind the seat, secured with a strap I sewed myself. It wasn't craziness. I knew she was gone, but I needed to pretend it hadn't been complete. At first, I talked to her. Silly things, comments about the load, the weather, the tricky curve near Amarillo. Later, I went quiet, not because it passed, but because it hurt less to keep it just for me. I went back on the road 5 weeks after she was gone. Not because I was strong, but because I couldn't sleep in the house anymore. The bed felt too open without her. I got used to the idea of living between freight, asphalt, and memory. Never took time off, never left the urn at home. Once, a girl from the trucking company wanted to clean the cab while I was having coffee. When I saw her opening the door, I ran over, spoke harshly to her. She didn't understand, but it wasn't anger, it was fear of someone touching what remained. I know that for many people this seems excessive, but only those who have lost the way I lost understand what it's like to cling to something that doesn't breathe. It was in August of last year that it happened. I was coming from Oregon with a load of lumber, scheduled for delivery in Denver, but they called from dispatch saying there was a route change. I had to take Highway 16 through Wyoming, that stretch between Worland and Buffalo. That section is tricky, ups and downs with no shoulder, tight grade curves, and plenty of trucks that get stuck through carelessness. I'd been through there dozens of times, knew the potholes, the speed traps, where you could brake without sliding. But that day it was drizzling. that fine mist that dirties the windshield more than it helps. I'd been behind the wheel for 14 hours. It wasn't the first time I'd pushed past my limit, but this time my body warned me. I blinked too long, that's all it was, just a blink. When I opened my eyes, I saw a compact car braking hard in front of me. I didn't think, just threw the truck to the side, tried to control the trailer, but the mud on the shoulder was soft. Caught the embankment. It was a hard thud, didn't roll, didn't hurt anyone, just got stuck sideways, half on the road, half off. But inside the cab, the urn had come loose. The cloth tore, and Linda's ashes were on the seat, on the dashboard, on my hands, on the floor of the cab. I sat there, unable to breathe. It was like she'd been scattered to the wind, something nobody could hold on to. I don't know how much time passed. I just remember trying to gather it with my hands. My whole body was shaking. I picked up what was left. There were still pieces of cloth, put as much as I could inside, got out of the cab, walked a few yards to the side, near the low fence of a pasture. I knelt in the mud and started digging with my hands. It was raining and I was digging. Made a shallow hole, but deep enough. Put the tied cloth there, covered it with dirt, pressed it down with my hands. I didn't pray, didn't say anything out loud, just cried. Sat there with my knees soaked, and my face hot despite the cold rain. But I made a promise to myself. I promised I'd come back. After that day, nothing was the same. The truck cab felt different, even after cleaning it, removing the seat, washing the dashboard. It seemed like her smell had gotten into the foam, or maybe it was all in my head. But every time I got in there, I felt something in my chest, like I was invading a place that wasn't mine anymore. I stayed parked at the company yard for a week. They said I was lucky not to have rolled, that the damage was small compared to what could have been. But nobody knew what I'd really lost there. Nobody understood that for me it wasn't just mud, torn seats, and lost freight money. It was her. It was the last of what I carried of Linda. It was the last place where I could pretend there was still something alive between us. After that, I went back on the road because what else was I going to do? Go home, sit on the couch, watch TV, wait for time to pass like it was doing me a favor. No. For me, the road was the way not to drown. But a month passed, then two, and then I had to go back through that route. It was urgent freight, early morning pickup in Worland with delivery in Casper. Same stretch, and I went. Went silent, went with a tight chest, but didn't say anything to anyone. When the curve came up, I already knew where it was. Didn't need GPS, didn't need signs. It was like the asphalt had the memory of what I'd buried there. I slowed down, touched the brakes lightly, looked toward the shoulder, and I swear on everything I hold sacred that there was someone there. Someone sitting with a light-colored dress, hair pulled to the side, face turned toward the road. I couldn't see clearly, it was still dawn. But the posture, the way of sitting with hands in her lap, so similar, so exactly the same that I froze. I passed, didn't stop, but my eyes searched the rearview mirror, and for a split second she was still there. Didn't run, didn't wave, didn't ask for help. Just sat there watching. The stretch ended, the road continued, and I stayed quiet. Didn't tell anyone, not even myself. I didn't want to repeat that out loud. On the next trip, another load to Colorado. Same route, same curve, same emptiness in my stomach, same thing in the air, like time changed inside the cab when I got close. And again, she was there. Sometimes closer to the embankment, sometimes further back, almost at the edge of the fence. but always on the same side. The side where I'd buried the cloth with what remained of her. I tried to convince myself it was just imagination, that it was grief transforming shadow into face. But there was something there that wasn't just memory, because even when I wasn't expecting it, even when I came distracted, listening to the radio, or when the sun was hitting head-on, something would warn me that she was approaching. It wasn't fear, it was certainty. And that became part of my routine. Every time freight took me on that route, I'd prepare myself. Made the coffee stronger, showered at the truck stop, straightened my clothes like I was going to meet someone. And in my crooked way, I was. Linda would appear, not always clearly, but always present. There was one time I stopped the truck further ahead, walked back to the spot, stood at a distance watching. And I saw someone there. It wasn't invention. But when I got close, there was nothing anymore. No footprint, no mark in the mud. Just the wind hitting the fence lightly and a silence that hurt my ears. I went back to the truck, put it in gear, continued the trip with the feeling that something had looked inside me. From then on, I started taking notes. Made a small notebook hidden in the upper part of the cab. Every time I saw her or thought I saw her, I'd write down the day, the time, the weather, how the sky looked, how I was feeling. Not to prove anything to anyone, but to understand if I was losing my mind or gaining a kind of presence that nobody else could see. But the more I wrote, the more certain I became that she was there. Not as a ghost, not as a scare, but as a part of her that remained, that I'd left, or that refused to go. There was a time I started choosing freight routes on purpose. When I saw I could fit Highway 16 into the route, I'd accept it, even if it was a bit longer, even if it paid less. Sometimes I'd even lie about the reason, said it was a matter of habit, that I preferred that stretch. But it was a lie. The truth was I needed to pass by her, even if just for a glance, even if just to confirm she was still there. It's hard to explain this to someone who hasn't lost the way I lost. But sometimes you don't want to move forward. You want to park where it hurt most, because that's where memory still has shape, where she still has smell, weight, silence. I knew it wasn't healthy, but it was that or complete emptiness. On the road, nobody asked me much. Truckers don't usually meddle in each other's lives, and whoever looks at me sees a tired, quiet man, maybe with back problems, not someone who buried his wife on an embankment. But there was a day I thought things had gone too far. I was climbing the mountain at night, coming back from a Cheyenne run, light rain, poor visibility. When I got near the curve, I slowed down, looked at the spot, saw that she was there. Clearer than ever in a light-colored dress, hair on her shoulder, serene face. And this time she wasn't sitting. She was standing, facing the road. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't fear, it was a mixture of guilt and need. I passed slowly, pulled the truck over further ahead, got out. It was still raining. I was slipping in the mud, but went anyway. When I got to the spot, nothing. Just wet brush, crooked fence, and a strong smell of turned earth. I stood there for minutes, maybe more. Went back soaked, trembling not from cold, but from something I can't name. That dawn I slept at the truck stop, couldn't continue the trip. The next day I sat with my notebook, wrote everything down, but the words seemed too small for what I'd felt. I thought about getting help, a psychologist maybe. But how do you explain that every time you pass a curve, you see the woman who's already gone? They'll give you medicine, say it's complicated grief, call it visual hallucination induced by longing. But nobody will understand that sometimes that was the only thing that made life continue in a way that was still bearable. Linda wasn't an apparition, wasn't a scare. She was the way my pain found not to become despair. And there was something in that curve, a weight, a kind of presence that wasn't just in me. Because one day, a trucker I knew, Clemens, asked me, "Hey Mario, on that mountain curve, you ever get a weird feeling? Something in the air?" I swallowed hard, said no, changed the subject. But that hit me deep. Maybe it wasn't just my thing. Maybe the place had really kept something that nobody knows how to name. I was never the same after that rainy day. Became more introspective, talked even less. My daughter would call, ask when I was going to stop driving, said I was getting old, that I could help in her trucking company office. But how was I going to say that if I stopped driving, I'd stop seeing her mother too? How do you explain that? I wasn't ready to bury the rest, because it wasn't just a ritual, it was all that remained. And the curve became my altar without candles, without prayer, just presence and silence. At the end of that year, there was a pause in freight runs. Calendar stuff, fleet maintenance, year-end break. I stayed about 3 weeks at home. The house was clean, organized. My daughter had hired a woman to come by occasionally, but it didn't help. It wasn't dust that bothered me, it was her silence. The bedroom stayed the same. Clothes folded, book on the nightstand, the blue comforter from the trailer days still in the bottom drawer. I opened the drawer one night, ran my hand over the pattern, and the urge that came over me was to take that and leave again. Because staying still when absence screams louder is unbearable. On the first January run, the destination threw me back on Highway 16. It was supposed to be a calm trip, light load, clear weather. But since I left the base, anxiety came along. When I was approaching the curve, something in me started asking to stop. Not just to pass slowly, to really stop. Pull over, get out, look, and I obeyed. I got to the spot, turned off the truck, breath deep, got out slowly. No rain, no wind, just stifling heat and a strong smell of dry brush. I went to the place where I dug the hole. The mud was hard now, but there was still a mark. You could see the difference in the soil tone. I stood there without knowing what to look for, and it was then that I saw her again. At the edge of the fence on the other side. She was sitting, didn't look back, didn't get up, just stayed there the same way with the same light clothes, hair loosely tied behind her ear, like she'd never left. I was paralyzed. I don't know for how long, but I know that at some point she disappeared without noise, without warning, like the air swallowed her slowly. I went back to the truck with a knot in my throat, started the engine, put it in gear, and thought about avoiding that road forever. But then a question came that cut through me. What if I stop passing through here and never see her again? What if this piece of road is the only place in the world where there's still something that looks at me that way? What if God, or whoever, decided to leave me a little piece of her in that corner, so I wouldn't go completely crazy? That night I slept in Rock Springs and dreamed of her. It wasn't a strange or supernatural dream. It was just us having coffee in silence, like we used to do at home. Her stirring the spoon slowly and me pretending I wasn't afraid to wake up. I woke up with a wet face. Since then, I never stopped passing through there. I've thought about changing routes, thought about stopping driving. My daughter keeps insisting. But there are things bigger than logic, and that curve became my meeting point, my altar without faith. Some drivers pass through there and honk out of superstition. Some people say it's a place with bad energy, that too many people died there. Some even pray quietly when they pass. But not me. I pass slowly, look at the corner, and she's there. Not always with her face, sometimes just a silhouette, sometimes just a shadow, but I feel it's her. The part of her that didn't leave me, or the part of me that refuses to let go. It doesn't matter. The truth is she waits for me there, on her last curve, on the piece of ground where I lost everything, and at the same time found a reason to continue. All my life I preferred to listen. I was always one to swallow hard, to let time carry away what hurts. But there are things that don't go away, like the sound of the rumble strip when you hit it lightly. It keeps echoing inside. I've been driving since my early 20s. I'm 59 now. But what I'm going to tell you isn't about cargo or customers or mechanics. It's about what we carry in the passenger seat and what we lose right there in the middle of the highway. My name is Gene, and for 16 years my road partner was called Dale. We met in Fresno back in the 90s. Young idiots wanting to rack up miles just to watch the odometer spin. Over time, each of us got married. Each tried life outside the cab. But no woman could stand this lifestyle for long. Not mine, not his. I was the first to separate after about 5 years. 4 years later, he did too. The road swallows everything, even what we love. After that, we got even closer, became a fixed team. We'd switch off perfectly. I'd go to such and such stretch. He'd take the overnight. I'd wake up for coffee. He'd sleep until 11. Nobody argued with nobody. There were weeks we'd do 3,000 miles without saying more than 12 sentences. And it was still real partnership. Good friendship is like that. Doesn't need to prove anything. Dale was my best man at my wedding. I was his. We shared bottles, shared fever on the road, shared debt, shared almost everything. And even so, there was one thing we didn't share. One thing that stayed just with me. It was on a trip in 2017. We left Phoenix heading to Kansas City, hauling packaged feed. The stretch between Flagstaff and Gallup is dry, long, seems like it'll never end. Just straight lines and scrub on both sides. A place that seems invented just to make you think too much. Dale always took that shift. He liked driving at night, said it was calmer, less traffic, more road to feel. That day I was tired, my head kind of heavy. I fell asleep as soon as we passed Flagstaff, and to this day I wish I'd stayed asleep. I woke up with the cab light on, too much silence, truck stopped, engine off, and the feeling that something had slipped away from normal. I looked to the side. Dale wasn't there. Just his empty seat and the door half open. I sat up slowly with that dry-mouth taste and got out. He was standing beside the truck, looking at the low scrub. He didn't look at me, didn't say anything when I approached. It took me a few seconds to see what he was seeing, and then I saw it too. In the middle of the sparse brush, almost touching the shoulder, a motorcycle was lying on its side. The front end destroyed, headlight broken, wheel twisted. It looked like it had been thrown there. Only then did he speak, low and hoarse, like someone who doesn't believe what they're saying. It was a shadow, Gene. I swear to God, I just heard the noise. Thought it was an animal. I stood there with my throat locked up. Got closer and saw he hadn't had the courage to get near. It was a man lying on his side, legs curled up, one arm twisted, but still breathing. His eyes were moving. He wasn't talking, but he was alive. and I didn't know what to do. Jean, with 51 years on the road, paralyzed like a child. I looked at Dale. He was shaking, sweating, pale, saying it was better to call for help, explain, saying the fault might not be ours, that it was night, dry road, motorcycle in the dark with no shoulder, that he didn't even see the guy. And I heard all that, and it was me who said, "Let's get out of here." I don't know how those words came out of my mouth. Don't know what came over me. Maybe fear, maybe cowardice, maybe just that stupid urge to run. I said nobody could prove the fault was ours, that the bike could have fallen by itself, that if the kid died it wasn't our fault, that the police would screw us even if we were right, that the company would drop us, that we could lose everything. And Dale went quiet. He didn't answer, just kept looking. Then he got back in with his shoulders sagging and started the engine. We drove more than 600 miles after that, but the trip never had sound again. We rolled the rest of the night in silence. Every curve was one more weight, every highway post through light inside the cab like it was pointing at me, like it was saying, "You saw, and you did nothing." Dale didn't say anything else. Didn't ask if I wanted to drive, didn't complain about being tired, just went. And his silence hurt more than screaming. We reached a truck stop past Albuquerque with the day starting to break. We stopped, got out, each went his own way. I went into the bathroom, splashed water on my face, looked in the mirror. It seemed like I'd aged about 6 years that night. Deep-set eyes, locked jaw. Outside, Dale was leaning against the side of the truck, arms crossed, looking at the ground. And that's how he stayed for the rest of the time. You could see from a distance that he didn't want to share space or words or road anymore. That stretch to Kansas City that we used to do on autopilot became a minefield. Any noise on the radio made me tense. Any police car on the interstate made my stomach freeze. And Dale kept going mute. Breakfast was silent. Lunch was separate. When I tried to make conversation, he just shook his head, so I shut up too. Because anything I said would sound dirty, forced, useless. I tried to justify it in my head, told myself it was the right thing, that we couldn't do any more than that it was night, that it wasn't our fault. But the truth is, what really hurt wasn't what happened to the kid on the motorcycle. It was the way Dale looked at me. Or better, the way he didn't look anymore. We got to Kansas City late afternoon. The plan was to leave the truck at the company warehouse, unload the next morning, and get a room to sleep. But he didn't even wait. Got out with his duffel bag over his shoulder, didn't look at me, walked to the gate on foot without a word. No see you later, no take care. And I stayed there inside with my hand on the steering wheel, feeling his empty seat, just his smell still on the seatbelt. His silence stuck to the window. The next morning he didn't show up to unload or to give notice. I tried calling about 6 times, just rang. The following week I sent a message in our group chat, the one for old road guys. He didn't even read it. Days turned into weeks, then months, until one day at a truck stop in Oklahoma, I ran into someone who knew him, a guy who'd done some trips with us years back. I asked if he had news about Dale. The guy looked at me kind of uncomfortable, looked down. Dropped everything, Gene. Went to rural New Mexico, raising pigs on his sister's ranch. Doesn't want to know about trucking or anybody. I thanked him, pretended everything was fine. But it was like someone had closed the lid over us. I kept driving alone for a while, then tried to team up with another guy from the company, but it didn't work. I was used to Dale's way, his silences, the way he gripped the wheel. Nobody else fit. It seemed like everyone talked too loud or expected laughter where there was only room for memory. Sometimes I'd take the same stretch again, that one on I-40 near Gallup, and there's where the silence screams. Every time I pass through there, I look to the left side of the road, even knowing there's nothing there anymore. No motorcycle, no trampled brush, no mark on the ground. But the image continues, like it's painted on the windshield. The kid lying there, his eyes trying to say something, Dale shaking, me silent. Nobody talked about guilt, nobody talked about sin, but everyone feels it every day. And when I hit the left turn signal, it's like I'm activating a memory, one that will never leave me. Some people think the worst accidents are the ones you see in the rearview mirror, but they're not. The worst are the ones nobody saw but you, and even then you couldn't do anything. After Dale disappeared, life went on. I mean, it pretended to go on. I kept driving, did a few more years, then changed companies, became one of those guys everyone knows but nobody calls for lunch. Always polite, but with a way that says he doesn't want conversation. The truth is, I was never the same. Something was missing from my side, and I don't even know if it was Dale himself or the man I was when he was there. It's just that we share so much road, heat, breakdowns, flat tires, the smell of reheated food, the fear of sleeping at the wrong truck stop, that we end up forgetting that one day everything can go quiet. And when it goes quiet, it's not all at once. It goes silent little by little. First, it's the empty seat. Then the radio nobody adjusts anymore. Then the coffee that gets cold because there's nobody to share it with. Then the longing that doesn't come with a name, but with absence. There was a time I thought about writing to him, explaining, saying I'd been scared, that it wasn't cowardice. Or maybe it was, but that it wasn't easy to see that clearly right then. That I thought I was protecting us, and that afterward it was too late. But I never wrote because there was nothing to write. Because there are things that words don't heal. I remember about 3 years later, I saw a photo of the ranch where he was staying. Someone shared it in a group without even knowing he was my ex-partner. It was a low fence, some chickens loose, and a pen with 4 white pigs, fat ones. In the background, a porch with an empty plastic chair. I stared at that photo like it was a goodbye, because that's what it was. Right there, I understood I'd never have the same seat occupied again, never have that comfortable silence again, just the other kind, the one that crushes. Nowadays, if someone asks if I ever had a steady partner, I say yes, but that it was a long time ago, and I leave it at that. I don't like telling the rest because nobody would understand, and because I don't understand it myself yet. Sometimes I pass through that stretch on I-40 and keep looking at the left lane. There's nothing there, just the brush that grows again. But I swear that if I close my eyes for a second, I still see everything like it was. The kid lying with his chest rising slowly, the sound of the wind, the smell of hot dust, Dale's voice shaking like it was the first time he'd ever doubted me. And then the silence. That silence is what accompanies me most, more than the engine rumble, more than the brakes on the mountain, more than missing the good things. Because that silence carries what I lost. Dale wasn't just a road partner. He was a brother, one of those you don't choose but you gain. And I lost him in the worst way. It wasn't because he died. It was because he stayed alive but didn't want to be near me anymore. And that nobody fixes. I don't know if the motorcycle kid died. I never looked, never wanted to know, because part of me knows he didn't survive, and the other part knows that if he did survive, he was never the same again. Just like I wasn't either. Today I keep driving, sometimes sleep in the same seat he used to sleep in. Smell the scent that's not even there anymore. Listen to old music just to see if something comes back. But nothing comes back. And every time I signal left, whether to make a turn, change lanes, or just pull over on the shoulder, I remember. I remember the shadow in the brush, the kid stretched out, the decision I made for both of us, and the man who never called me brother again. And that's where I swallow hard and keep going. I don't really know what made me tell this story now. And I don't know if I'm trying to clear my conscience or just put it out there to see if anyone understands what I felt. But there are things you try to bury that keep clawing their way back up, like weeds through concrete, showing up right when you think you've finally got your life together. It was supposed to be just another haul across the Midwest. I was coming out of Kansas City with a load of electronics, had made it through Topeka, and was rolling toward Denver on Interstate 70. Weather was perfect, truck was purring like a kitten, and I had plenty of cushion time before my delivery window opened. I pulled into this truck stop outside of Hayes, one of those places that looks like it's been there since Eisenhower was president. Peeling paint on a faded sign, flickering neon that probably hadn't worked right since the Clinton administration. And that particular smell of diesel fumes mixed with prairie dust that gets into everything. It was late afternoon, sun hanging low and orange, casting long shadows across the mostly empty lot. Just a handful of cars scattered around, an old Winnebago with Colorado plates, and a skinny dog picking through trash near the dumpster. I wasn't just hungry. I needed to move, needed to feel my legs again after 6 straight hours behind the wheel. Did my usual routine, hit the restroom, grabbed a bottle of Coke and a bag of Funyuns from inside. The cashier was this kid, who couldn't have been more than 19, half asleep behind bulletproof glass, scrolling through TikTok videos with the sound turned up too loud. That's when I noticed her. She was sitting cross-legged on the concrete right next to the payphone. Yeah, they still had one of those ancient things, with a small canvas messenger bag beside her. Wearing faded jeans and a plain white t-shirt that had seen better days. What struck me wasn't how she looked, though she was pretty in that effortless way some women just are. It was how completely still she sat. Not checking her phone, not looking around for help, not wearing that desperate expression you see on people stranded on the road. She just sat there, patient as a cat, like she knew exactly how long she needed to wait and wasn't worried about it. I've got this thing, this need to be acknowledged, to make contact, even when I don't want anything specific. Sometimes I think it's just loneliness talking, but other times I wonder if it's something uglier. Like I need to test my own importance, see if I still register as someone worth noticing. I walked past her kind of slowly, hoping she'd look up, maybe start a conversation, ask for help. But nothing. Didn't even glance my way. That bothered me more than it should have. Got under my skin in a stupid way, like her indifference was somehow a personal insult. So I circled back, cleared my throat and said, "Afternoon." Real casual, like we were neighbors meeting at the mailbox. She looked up then, and her response was immediate and cold. "I'm not looking for a ride." Just like that. Direct eye contact for maybe 2 seconds, then back to staring at the horizon. Right there, I should have understood the message. Should have nodded, said fair enough, and walked away. But I felt something twist in my chest. Rejection mixed with embarrassment, mixed with this stupid male pride that couldn't handle being dismissed by someone who didn't owe me anything in the first place. I went back to my rig, climbed into the cab, but couldn't bring myself to fire up the engine. Instead, I sat there drinking that Coke, adjusting my mirrors, fiddling with the radio, all while stealing glances at her in my side mirror. After about 10 minutes of this pathetic display, I climbed back down and walked over again. Told myself I was being helpful, neighborly. Maybe she was thirsty, maybe she needed to use someone's phone, but deep down I knew it was just stubbornness dressed up as kindness. This time when she looked at me, there was something different in her eyes. Not fear or annoyance, but a kind of weary recognition, like she'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it ended. "You heading toward Denver?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I told her I was, and she stood up with the fluid motion of someone who'd made a decision that had been ready for a while. Slung that messenger bag over her shoulder and walked toward my passenger door without another word, without looking back at me. Right then I should have known. Thought I'd accomplished something, but really I just stepped into a game where I didn't even know the rules. She climbed into the cab like she'd done it 1,000 times before, settled into the passenger seat, and pulled the door shut with a soft click. Buckled her seatbelt and stared straight ahead through the windshield like I wasn't even there. I fired up the Detroit diesel, feeling like I was in control of the situation. That's what I told myself, that her accepting the ride meant I'd read the situation right, that she'd changed her mind about me, that I'd somehow won something worth winning. But she wasn't one of those passengers who fill the silence with chatter. Didn't crane her neck to look at the CB radio or ask about the sleeper berth or comment on the air freshener hanging from my mirror. When I asked where exactly in Denver she was headed, she said she had family there. When I asked if she'd been traveling long, she said not too long. Every answer was a dead end, delivered in that same quiet voice without any invitation to keep digging. At first I tried to keep things light, made observations about the weather, told a couple of road stories, asked if she wanted me to stop for coffee or something to eat. She said no thank you to everything. Polite but final, like she was conserving words for something more important. And that started eating at me, because in my mind I'd already written the script for how this was supposed to go. We'd warm up to each other, find some common ground, maybe share a laugh about something. She'd relax, open up a little, and by the time we rolled into Denver, well, who knows what might happen. But it wasn't happening. The more miles we covered, the more I felt like her presence was holding up a mirror I didn't want to look into, showing me the kind of man I really was underneath all my rationalizations. And still I kept pushing. Commented on a small tattoo on her wrist, some kind of bird. Asked if she was in college, if she was from Colorado originally, told her she had interesting eyes. Tried to sound casual and charming, threw in a few chuckles at my own observations. But it felt like performing a one-man show for an empty theater. The breaking point came when I reached over and adjusted the air conditioning, letting my hand rest on the back of her seat for just a moment longer than necessary. Not touching her, not even close, but making my presence felt in a way that crossed a line I didn't even realize was there. She turned to look at me then, slow and deliberate, and said something that still burns in my memory. "You really don't get it, do you?" That was all. Said it without anger, without raising her voice, without any trace of fear or threat. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm certainty she'd shown since climbing into my truck. Then she asked me to let her out. My hands went cold on the steering wheel. I told her we were still 50 miles from anywhere, that it wasn't safe, that I'd drop her at the next truck stop. She checked her phone, first time I'd seen her use it, looked at the mile markers, and said she wanted out at the next exit. The silence that followed felt like it was pressing down on the cab, making the air thick and hard to breathe. My shirt started sticking to my back with sweat, and I kept checking my mirrors like something was following us down that empty stretch of interstate. When we reached exit 247, I pulled onto the shoulder and hit my hazard lights. She opened her door immediately, climbed down without a word, and started walking toward the off-ramp. That's when I saw the dark sedan parked on the overpass above us. No flashers, no headlights, just sitting there like a spider in its web. As she walked up the ramp, the sedan's passenger door opened and a man got out. Average height, average build, wearing a black baseball cap and dark jeans. Nothing threatening about his appearance, but something in the way he stood there, arms at his sides, perfectly still, made my blood turn to ice water. He didn't say anything, didn't gesture or make any kind of move. Just looked down at me through my windshield with the kind of calm attention you might give to an interesting insect. And when I glanced back at her, she was looking at me too. Not with hatred or fear, but with something worse, pity. The same patient certainty she'd shown all along, like she knew exactly what was going to happen next. After she got into that sedan and they drove away, I sat there with my engine idling for a good 20 minutes, watching the heat shimmer rise off the asphalt. My hands were shaking when I finally put the truck in gear and got back on the interstate, and not from the diesel vibration. I tried to convince myself it was all coincidence, that she was just strange, that the guy could have been her boyfriend or her brother or whoever. Tried to slap that explanation over what I'd seen like duct tape over a cracked windshield, but it wouldn't hold. I finished that run to Denver like a man driving away from a house fire, except the fire was inside my head and it came with me. For the first couple of weeks, nothing happened. I delivered my load, picked up another one heading back to Missouri, posted pictures on Instagram like everything was normal. Smiled for selfies at truck stops, shared memes about life on the road, wrote captions full of that fake trucker swagger that plays so well online. Then the little things started. A photo of my rig parked at a pilot in Lemon, Colorado. A stop I didn't remember making showed up in a text from a number I didn't recognize. Just the image, no message. The picture was taken from across the parking lot, like someone had been watching. A few days later, I ran into Bobby Hutchins at a way station outside of Salina. Bobby and I had been running similar routes for years, sometimes convoy together for company. But when he saw me that day, he got this weird look on his face, waved from about 50 yards away, then found an excuse to get back in his truck and leave. Wouldn't even come close enough to talk. Then there was Danny Reeves, a young driver who worked some of the same corridors I did. Kid couldn't have been more than 25, always eager to learn, always asking the older drivers for advice. He stopped showing up at the usual spots. When I finally tracked down his number and called him, He answered on the first ring like he'd been expecting me. "Jake," he said, and his voice sounded different, older. "You stepped in something, didn't you?" Before I could ask what he meant, the line went dead. I tried calling back, but the number was disconnected. That's when I started to understand. The woman hadn't been stranded at that truck stop by accident. She'd been there for a reason, waiting for exactly the kind of man who would see her silence as a challenge instead of a boundary. Who would mistake her stillness for invitation instead of caution? And I was that man. I was the one who couldn't take no for an answer, who had to keep pushing, who thought my attention was some kind of gift she should be grateful for. Nothing had actually happened in that cab. I kept telling myself that. I hadn't touched her, hadn't threatened her, hadn't done anything that would make the evening news. But I'd done everything that mattered, hadn't I? I'd shown her, and whoever was watching, exactly what kind of person I was underneath all my rationalizations. Since that day, the road hasn't felt the same. There are drivers who nod when they see me, but won't make conversation. Others who used to convoy with me suddenly have different routes, different schedules. And I never know how far the word has spread. Last month, I spent 3 sleepless nights parked at a rest area outside of Amarillo, convinced that every set of headlights in my mirrors belonged to that dark sedan. It wasn't the police I was afraid of, it was her. Because if one thing became crystal clear, it's that she hadn't been lost on the side of that road. She'd been there to find out who else was lost. I was lost, and I still am. Still driving the same routes, still making my deliveries, but I'm not the same man who pulled into that truck stop outside of Hayes. Not the man I thought I was, anyway. And if you ask me whether I regret what happened, I regret not understanding that first no. I regret not recognizing that some women don't have to raise their voices to be heard. They just have to wait. And when the right people are listening, they don't need to shout anymore. The road teaches you things about yourself that you can't learn anywhere else. Sometimes those lessons come in the form of a breakdown that strands you in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes they come in the form of a way station that costs you a day's pay. And sometimes they come in the form of a woman sitting quietly beside a payphone, waiting to show you exactly who you really are. I've been clearing trails and cutting paths through the wilderness for about 12 years now. It's backbreaking work, but it pays well when you land a good contract. This particular job came to me in late September, when the leaves were just starting to turn. A well-dressed man from the city had contacted me about cutting a new trail through some dense forest up in the Appalachian foothills. He said he'd purchased property deep in the woods and needed access to it. What struck me as odd was that he mentioned several other contractors had turned down the job, despite the generous pay he was offering. When I asked why, he just shrugged and said they probably didn't want to work that far from town. The money was too good to pass up, so I didn't press the issue further. I loaded up my truck with all my gear: chainsaw, machete, shovel, stakes, and enough supplies for a week-long job. The property was about 40 miles outside of town, down increasingly narrow dirt roads, until I reached what looked like an untouched wilderness. The forest was the kind of old growth you rarely see any more massive oaks and maples, so dense their canopy blocked out most of the sunlight, creating an almost cave-like atmosphere underneath. The first few days went smoothly enough. I'd start at dawn, cutting through smaller branches with my machete, taking down problem trees with the chainsaw, and marking my path with bright orange stakes. It was demanding work, but I'd been doing it long enough that my body had adapted to the physical demands. What bothered me most during those first days was the absolute silence. In all my years working in forests across 3 different states, I'd never encountered such complete quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed absent. It was an oppressive kind of silence that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. On the 4th day, I discovered something that made me stop dead in my tracks. In an area I'd cleared the previous afternoon, all the trees were now leaning at identical angles, as if something massive had pushed through and bent them sideways. But there were no broken branches on the ground, no tracks in the soft earth, nothing to indicate what could have caused such uniform damage. It was as if the trees had simply decided to bow down all at once. A foul smell hung in the air around that spot, the sickly sweet stench of decay, like roadkill that had been baking in the summer sun for days. I searched the area thoroughly, but found no dead animals, no obvious source for the odor. The smell seemed to be rising from the earth itself, as if something was rotting deep underground. I tried to push through and continue working, but the stench was so overpowering it made my stomach turn. By evening, I had a splitting headache that aspirin couldn't touch. The next morning brought a new mystery. When I went to retrieve my machete from my pack, I found it completely covered in rust. This made no sense. I always clean and oil my tools after each day's work, and the night before it had been spotless. Now it looked like it had been sitting in a swamp for months, covered in dark, flaky corrosion. Thinking it might be the unusual humidity in this particular forest, I switched to my backup machete. But by the end of that day, the same thing had happened. The pristine blade was covered in the same dark rust, despite being brand new that morning. In 15 years of doing this work, I'd never seen metal corrode so rapidly. That's when the breathing started. Every time I stopped to rest or take a drink of water, I'd hear it, a heavy, labored breathing coming from somewhere behind me. It sounded like a large animal panting, but muffled, as if the creature was breathing through thick fabric. Whenever I spun around to look, there was nothing there. But the sensation of being watched never left me. Eyes following my every movement from the shadows between the trees. The breathing became more frequent as the days passed. Sometimes it seemed close enough that I could feel warm air on the back of my neck. Other times it echoed from deeper in the forest. But it was always there, always behind me, like a constant reminder that I wasn't alone in this place. I started working faster, desperate to finish the job and get out of there. The forest was affecting me in ways I'd never experienced before. My sleep was restless, filled with dreams of being chased through endless corridors of trees. During the day, I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly, jumping at every shadow. On the 7th day, everything came to a head. I was cutting through a particularly thick vine when the smell of decay suddenly intensified to an almost unbearable level. It was no longer just the sweet smell of rot. Now it carried undertones of sewage and something chemical, like ammonia. The combination hit me like a physical blow, making my vision blur and my knees buckle. I had to stop working and back away from the area just to catch my breath. That's when the breathing sound got louder, much louder. It was right behind me now, so close I could feel moisture against my neck. The air itself seemed thick and putrid, like breathing through wet cloth. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The world tilted sideways, colors bleeding together, and then everything went black. When I came to, the sun was setting, and my head felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. I was lying on my back in the middle of the clearing, my tools scattered around me, but thankfully all accounted for. As I slowly sat up, trying to get my bearings, I noticed something in the soft mud beside me that made my blood run cold. There, pressed deep into the earth just inches from where my head had been lying, was the clearest handprint I'd ever seen. But it wasn't human. The print was enormous, easily twice the size of my own hand, with fingers that were far too long and ending in what looked like claw marks. The impression was so deep it seemed like whatever made it must have weighed several 100 pounds. I didn't wait around to investigate further. I threw my tools into the truck and drove out of there without looking back, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I never finished that job, even though it meant losing several $1,000s. When the client called a few days later asking why I disappeared, I made up some excuse about a family emergency. There was no way I was going to tell him the truth. He'd think I'd lost my mind. Ever since then, I can't work in dense forests anymore. Even small jobs in lightly wooded areas make me break out in a cold sweat. Every time I step under a canopy of trees, I start hearing that breathing again, and that smell of decay seems to follow me around like it's embedded in my clothes, my skin, my very being. The other contractors in the area have their own stories about that particular stretch of forest. They call it cursed, say there's something ancient living deep in those woods. Some of the older timers talk about creatures from Native American legends, beings that were old when the first Europeans arrived. After what I experienced out there, I don't doubt them for a second. And I'm certain that whatever I encountered is still out there, still waiting. Sometimes, on foggy mornings when the mist rolls in thick, I swear I can hear that breathing carried on the wind, getting closer. My cousin Jake and I have always been adventure seekers. Growing up in rural Montana, we spent our childhood exploring caves, climbing rock faces, and camping in places most people wouldn't dare to venture. When we got older, weekend camping trips became our way of escaping the stress of our jobs in town and reconnecting with the wilderness that raised us. We'd camped all over the region, from the Glacier National Park backcountry to remote spots in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. But there was one place we'd never been, Eagle's Peak, a mountain about 20 miles northeast of town. Local folks had plenty of stories about that mountain, most of them unsettling. The tales went back generations. Old-timers claimed that hikers had gone missing up there, only to be found days later in a state of complete terror, covered in scratches and unable to explain what had happened to them. Others swore they'd heard unearthly howls echoing from the peak on clear night sounds that didn't match any known wildlife in the area. Jake and I had always laughed off these stories as typical small-town folklore, the kind of legends that grow taller with each telling. We figured people just got spooked by the isolation, and their imaginations ran wild. So when we decided to spend a 3-day weekend up there in early October, we weren't expecting anything more than beautiful views and good fishing. We started the hike Friday afternoon, taking the old logging road that wound up the mountain's eastern face. The trail was well maintained for the first few miles, but as we climbed higher, it became increasingly overgrown and difficult to follow. By the time we reached our planned campsite, a flat clearing near a small stream about 2/3 of the way up, the sun was already low in the sky. The spot was perfect, level ground for our tent, fresh water, and an incredible view of the valley below. We could see the lights of town twinkling in the distance, and above us, the sky was already filling with more stars than you ever see in civilization. We built a fire, grilled some steaks we'd brought along, and spent the evening drinking beer and telling the same old stories we'd been sharing since high school. It was around 11:30 when we heard the first howl. At first, we assumed it was a coyote or maybe a wolf. Both were common enough in the area. But as we listened more carefully, something about the sound seemed off. It wasn't quite right for any animal we knew. The pitch was wrong, almost human but distorted, like someone trying to imitate a wolf's call, but not quite managing it. There was a quality to it that was deeply unsettling, a desperate, almost mournful tone that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Jake joked that it was probably some drunk hiker trying to scare us, and we both laughed, but I could tell he was as uncomfortable as I was. The sound came again a few minutes later, closer this time and clearer. Now we could definitely hear the human-like quality. It was as if someone was trying to scream, but their voice was so damaged they could only produce this horrible, strangled howling. I climbed up on a large boulder near our campsite to get a better view of the surrounding area. The full moon provided excellent visibility, casting everything in stark black and white. That's when I spotted movement on the trail about 200 yards below us. There was a figure moving up the path toward our camp, but its gait was all wrong. It lurched and staggered like someone with a severe leg injury, sometimes appearing to walk upright on two legs, other times dropping down to move on all fours. From that distance, it was hard to make out details, but it seemed to be roughly human-sized, maybe a bit larger. I called Jake over to look. As the figure got closer, we could see more disturbing details. It was covered in patchy, dark fur that looked diseased and mangy. Its limbs seemed disproportioned, too long and bent at unnatural angles. The head was oversized for its body and swayed from side to side as it moved, like it was too heavy to hold upright. What really unnerved us was that it seemed to be following our scent trail up the mountain, stopping occasionally to put its nose to the ground like a tracking dog. It was definitely coming straight for our campsite. Jake suggested we pack up and head down the mountain via a different route, but I was curious despite my fear. I wanted to see what this thing was. We'd brought a .30-06 rifle for protection against bears, and I felt confident we could handle whatever this turned out to be. The creature reached our camp around 2 in the morning. Our fire had burned down to just glowing coals, providing minimal light. It stayed at the edge of the illuminated area, partially hidden behind trees, but we could see its eyes reflecting the firelight yellow, and much larger than any normal animal's. For about 10 minutes, it just observed us. We sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Then it began to approach our gear, moving with surprising stealth for something that had appeared so clumsy from a distance. It sniffed our backpacks, our sleeping bags, even the clothes we'd hung on a line to dry. Its behavior was dog-like, but with an intelligence behind it that seemed almost human. That's when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. Around its neck was a braided leather cord with a small silver pendant, the exact same necklace my uncle had worn every day when I was a kid. Uncle Paul had disappeared on these mountains 15 years ago during a solo hunting trip. Search and rescue had found his rifle abandoned on a trail, but never found his body. The case had gone cold, and the family had eventually held a memorial service without ever knowing what happened to him. The creature must have sensed me staring at the necklace, because it suddenly raised its head and looked directly at me. That's when it released another one of those horrifying howls, but this time it was deafeningly loud, and so close it seemed to shake the ground beneath us. The sound was unmistakably a cry of anguish, like someone screaming for help, but unable to form words. I tried to speak, to ask if it was somehow my uncle, but the moment I opened my mouth, the thing turned and bolted up the mountainside with inhuman speed. Within seconds, it had vanished into the darkness, leaving only the echo of that terrible cry bouncing off the rocky peaks. We broke camp immediately and hiked down the mountain by moonlight, reaching our truck just as the sun was coming up. I've never been back to Eagle's Peak, and I've never told anyone in my family about what I saw that night. But sometimes, when the weather's changing and the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that mournful howling carried on the air from the direction of the mountain. And I can't help but wonder if my uncle is still up there somewhere, trapped in that form, trying to call for help, but unable to make anyone understand. I've been raising goats on my ranch in West Texas for the better part of 18 years. It's a family tradition that goes back 3 generations. My grandfather started with just a few head back in the 1940s. My father expanded the operation, and I've continued building on what they established. Goats are hardy animals, well suited to our harsh climate, and there's always been a steady market for them at the livestock auctions in San Angelo. In all my years of ranching, I could count on one hand the number of animals I'd lost to disease or predators. I knew every animal in my herd by sight, had names for most of them, and maintained strict routines that kept them healthy and safe. Every evening at sundown, I'd bring them into the corral. Every morning before dawn, I'd check them over for injuries or signs of illness before turning them out to pasture. It was a system that had worked perfectly for decades. We'd had occasional problems with coyotes and the rare mountain lion, but nothing that proper fencing and vigilance couldn't handle. Everything changed on a Monday in late March. When I went out for the morning check, I found one of my best breeding does, a beautiful Nubian named Duchess, lying motionless in the corner of the corral. But the state of her body was unlike anything I'd ever seen. She appeared completely deflated, as if someone had drained every drop of fluid from her body. The skin hung loose on her frame like an empty sack, but there wasn't a trace of blood anywhere. Most disturbing was the complete absence of wounds. No bite marks, no cuts, no signs of struggle. It was as if something had somehow extracted everything from inside her without breaking the skin. I'd seen animals killed by predators, struck by lightning, dead from disease, but never anything like this. Thinking it might be some new illness, I isolated the carcass and burned it well away from the corral to prevent contamination of the rest of the herd. I called the veterinarian in town, but he said without examining the animal, there was no way to determine the cause of death. Tuesday morning brought the same nightmare. This time it was Thunder, a young buck I'd been planning to use for breeding. Same condition, desiccated, empty, but without a mark on him. By Wednesday, I'd lost 2 more animals in identical circumstances. I decided to keep watch. Thursday night, I positioned myself in a deer blind that overlooked the entire corral area. I brought my 30-06, a thermos of coffee, and settled in for a long vigil. For hours, nothing happened. The goats were calm, some lying down to rest, others standing and chewing their cud. Everything appeared normal. It was just past 2 in the morning when I heard it, a dry, scraping sound like something being dragged across rough ground. I peered into the darkness, trying to locate the source. The quarter moon provided just enough light to make out shapes, but details were hard to distinguish. Then I saw it moving along the far side of the corral. The creature was unlike anything in my experience. About the size of a large dog, but its body was low to the ground and covered in what looked like scales or bony plates along its back. It moved in an odd, undulating way, almost serpentine, but it definitely had 4 legs. The neck was elongated, ending in a small head dominated by enormous, luminous eyes that reflected what little light was available. I watched in horrible fascination as it approached one of my sleeping goats. The animal didn't even wake up as the creature positioned itself over the goat's neck. Then it did something that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The thing's mouth opened in a way that seemed impossible, not like a normal animal's jaws, but like a vertical slit that extended from its chin nearly to the top of its head. Inside, I could see rows of tiny, needle-sharp teeth and a long, thin tongue that glistened in the moonlight. It lowered this horrific mouth to the goat's neck and began what I can only describe as feeding. I could hear a wet, sucking sound, like someone drawing liquid through a straw. The goat remained completely motionless, as if it was under some kind of spell. I tried to raise my rifle to take a shot, but my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't get a steady aim. That's when the creature became aware of my presence. It lifted its head from the goat and turned those massive eyes directly toward me. When it opened its mouth to look at me, I saw the most terrifying sight of my life. The interior of its mouth was lined with what looked like hundreds of tiny, sharp teeth, like a living grater. Its tongue, still dripping with some dark fluid, was far longer than should have been possible. The creature stared at me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it made a sound that was half hiss, half whistle, and began moving toward my position with frightening speed. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if I was paralyzed by fear. The last thing I remember clearly is seeing that awful mouth approaching my face. I woke up the next morning lying on the ground beside the deer blind, fully clothed, but feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My mouth tasted like copper and decay, and my tongue was sore and swollen. When I looked in the mirror later, I found tiny puncture marks on my tongue, as if someone had tried to pierce it with dozens of fine needles. Since that night, I haven't lost a single goat to the creature. Whatever it was seems to have vanished as mysteriously as it appeared, but I haven't been able to sleep properly since then. I wake up several times each night with that horrible taste in my mouth, and sometimes I feel like something is trying to drain the energy from my body, bit by bit. The marks on my tongue have faded, but never completely disappeared. And every time I see one of my goats looking weak or listless, I'm seized by the fear that the creature will return. Because I'm absolutely certain it's still out there somewhere, waiting for the right opportunity. And I have the terrible suspicion that whatever it took from me that night was just a sample, that it's still feeding on me somehow, drawing away my strength a little at a time from a distance I can't even comprehend. My father was the most stubborn man you'd ever meet. He was one of those practical types who didn't believe in anything he couldn't see, touch, or fix with his own two hands. Growing up on our farm in rural Kansas, I'd heard all the local folklore about supernatural creatures and unexplained phenomena, but Dad would just shake his head and call it nonsense. He had no patience for ghost stories or Native American legends about spirit beings. We'd lived on the same property for my entire life. Dad had inherited it from his father, and it had been in our family for 3 generations. It was a working farm with corn and wheat fields, a few head of cattle, and an old farmhouse that had weathered more storms than anyone could count. The day everything changed was in early November, one of those unseasonably warm afternoons when the wind picks up and you can feel a storm building on the horizon. Dad had gone out to the equipment barn to retrieve some tools he'd left there after working on the combine harvester. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard the most unusual sound coming from outside. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it kept growing louder and more intense. Through the window, I could see dust and debris swirling around the farmyard in a pattern I'd never witnessed before. Living in tornado country, I knew what normal wind patterns looked like, but this was different. I stepped outside to get a better look and stopped dead in my tracks. In the center of our farmyard was a whirlwind unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't the gray, funnel-shaped tornado we were used to in Kansas. This was a tight, vertical column of spinning air that seemed almost solid, filled with leaves, dirt, and small debris whirling at incredible speed. But what made my blood run cold was seeing Dad's old John Deere cap spinning around inside it, about 10 feet off the ground, as if it was dancing in the vortex. I called out for him, but my voice was completely swallowed by the roar of the wind. The sound was deafening, like standing next to a freight train or a jet engine at full throttle. I tried to get closer to the whirlwind, but the force of it knocked me flat on my back. From the ground, I watched in horror as that cap continued spinning in the center of the vortex, held aloft by some force I couldn't understand. The whole phenomenon lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, everything stopped. The wind died to nothing, the debris fell to the ground, and an eerie silence settled over the farm. Dad's cap landed in the dirt about 20 feet from where I was lying, crumpled and covered in dust. But Dad was nowhere to be found. I spent the rest of the afternoon searching every building on the property, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. I checked the barn, the equipment shed, the old silo, every place he might have taken shelter. I even walked the fence lines, thinking maybe he'd been thrown clear and was lying injured somewhere in the fields. As darkness fell, I began to consider that maybe he'd driven into town for something, and I'd missed seeing him leave. Perhaps he'd witnessed the whirlwind from a distance and decided to wait it out somewhere safe. I went inside to wait, figuring he'd return by morning with a logical explanation for everything. That night was when things got even stranger. I was going through my routine of checking the doors and windows before bed when I started hearing what sounded like soft laughter coming from outside. It was muffled, as if someone was laughing inside a barrel, and it was accompanied by the strangest footsteps I'd ever heard, a rhythmic hopping sound, like someone was jumping on one foot while circling the house. I crept to the window and peered out into the moonlit yard. I couldn't see anyone, but the sounds continued, that eerie, echoing laughter and the unmistakable sound of someone hopping in a circle around our house. The pattern was always the same. Hop, 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 pause, hop, 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 pause. This went on for nearly an hour. Sometimes the sounds seemed right outside my window. Other times they'd fade toward the barn area before circling back. I was too frightened to go outside and investigate. Something about the whole situation felt deeply wrong, like I was being watched by something that wasn't entirely human. When morning came, I rushed outside to look for evidence of whatever had been circling the house. What I found made me question my sanity. There were footprints in the soft dirt around the foundation, but they were the strangest tracks I'd ever seen. Some were normal boot prints, the size and pattern of Dad's work boots. But interspersed with these were smaller, deeper impressions, as if someone had been hopping on one foot with tremendous force. The hopping prints were so deep they'd gone through the topsoil to the clay underneath. But the most disturbing discovery was on the front porch. The wooden door frame was covered in scratch marks, deep gouges that went right through the paint to the bare wood. They looked like they'd been made by fingernails, but fingernails that were impossibly long and sharp. The scratches were stained dark, as if the nails had been dipped in charcoal or soot. On the bottom step of the porch, I found Dad's pipe, his favorite briarwood that had belonged to his own father. When I picked it up, I nearly dropped it again. The pipe was still warm, as if someone had just finished smoking it. Wisps of smoke were still rising from the bowl, and it smelled of Dad's usual tobacco blend. That was 8 months ago. I filed a missing person report, searched every hospital within 100 miles, and talked to every neighbor in the county. No one had seen him. No one knew anything. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him whole. The police investigation went nowhere. Without any evidence of foul play or signs of struggle, they eventually classified it as a voluntary disappearance, suggesting that maybe Dad had just decided to start a new life somewhere else. Anyone who knew him would realize how ridiculous that was. He'd never been more than 50 miles from the farm in his entire life. But the strangest part is what continues to happen. Every few weeks, especially when the weather's changing and the wind picks up, I hear that laughing again during the night. And every morning after these episodes, I find new footprints around the house. Always the same pattern of normal prints mixed with those deep, hopping impressions. Sometimes I find Dad's pipe in different locations around the property. Always warm, always smelling of fresh tobacco smoke. I've found it on the kitchen table, on the porch railing, even floating in the stock tank once. No matter where I put it for safekeeping, it always reappears somewhere else. I've thought about selling the farm and moving to town, but something keeps me here. Part of me hopes that whatever took Dad might bring him back the same way. But another part of me is terrified of what might return, because I'm becoming convinced that my father encountered something that night that challenged everything he believed about the world. And I have the growing fear that whatever happened to him, whatever he became or whatever took him, is still out there in those whirlwinds that dance across the prairie on stormy nights. I've been in the cattle business my whole life, so when I bought this ranch in eastern Colorado, I thought I knew exactly what I was getting into. The property had good pasture land, a solid barn for storing feed and equipment, and it was located in an area where cattle theft wasn't a major concern. I started with 20 head of mixed breeds and had plans to gradually build up the herd. The first few months went exactly as expected. The cattle adapted well to their new environment. The cows were producing good milk yields, and I was already considering purchasing additional stock. My routine was simple and effective. Early morning checks and milking, a trip to town to deliver milk to the local dairy cooperative, midday monitoring of the herd, and evening roundup to bring them into the corral for safety. It was during Lent that things started going wrong. The first sign of trouble was when I discovered that cattle were disappearing. Not escaping, the fencing was secure and all gates remained locked. They were simply vanishing without a trace. It started with a young heifer I'd recently purchased. One day she was grazing peacefully with the others. The next morning she was gone, as if she'd never existed. Initially, I suspected cattle rustlers, so I started sleeping with my shotgun within reach and became much more alert to sounds during the night. But the disappearances continued. Over the course of 2 weeks, I lost 6 head of cattle, which was putting a serious dent in both my finances and my peace of mind. I filed a report with the county sheriff, but without evidence of theft, there wasn't much they could do. My nearest neighbor, an elderly rancher named Bill Henderson, mentioned that he'd seen strange shadows moving around my property during the early morning hours. He described them as too large to be human and moving in an unnatural way, sometimes upright like people, sometimes on all fours like animals. I thought he might be exaggerating, but his words stuck with me. It was on a Saturday night in the final week of Lent that I decided to conduct my own surveillance. I set up a position in an old hunting blind that gave me a clear view of both the pasture and the corral area. I brought my rifle, a thermos of strong coffee, and prepared to stay awake all night if necessary. Around 11:45, I began hearing disturbing sounds coming from the equipment barn where I stored hay and ranch tools. It sounded like a large animal moving around inside, accompanied by heavy, labored breathing. My first thought was that one of my cows had somehow gotten into the barn looking for shelter. But the sounds were different, more aggressive, and agitated than any cattle I'd ever heard. I climbed down from the blind and approached the barn cautiously. The large sliding door was partially open, which I was certain I had secured before dark. The smell hit me before I could see anything. A combination of fresh blood, burned leather, and an overwhelming animal musk that was nothing like normal barnyard odors. I positioned myself beside the door and looked through the gap. What I saw inside made me question my sanity. There was a creature in my barn that defied every category of animal I knew. It was roughly the size of a full-grown man, but covered in coarse, dark fur. It was crouched over what remained of one of my missing steers, feeding with savage intensity. The sounds of its breathing and eating were amplified in the enclosed space, creating a symphony of carnage that turned my stomach. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see more details that made the scene even more horrifying. The creature's eyes reflected the minimal light coming through the door, bright yellow, and much larger than any natural predator's. Its snout was elongated and filled with teeth that seemed designed for tearing flesh. When it raised its head from its meal, I could see that its mouth was stained dark with blood. As it stood to its full height, I realized it was taller than me and built like something between a man and a wolf. Its hands ended in claws that were at least 4 inches long, and they dripped with blood and other fluids I didn't want to identify. That's when it sensed my presence. The creature turned those horrible yellow eyes toward the door where I was hiding. When it opened its mouth, whether to threaten me or simply because it was breathing hard from feeding, I saw rows of teeth like broken glass and a tongue that was far too long and dark for any earthly animal. I tried to bring my rifle to bear, but my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't maintain a steady aim. The thing let out a sound that was part growl, part howl, and began moving toward me with fluid speed that seemed to defy physics. I attempted to run, but tripped over my own feet and went down hard on the gravel. I felt its claws rake across my shoulder as I tried to roll away, sending waves of fire through my entire upper body. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not just the physical damage, but something deeper, as if those claws carried some kind of poison or curse. The last thing I remember clearly is seeing those massive teeth coming toward my face. I woke up the next morning naked in the middle of my pasture, with the sun already well above the horizon. My shoulder was a mess of deep scratches and puncture wounds, and there were what looked like bite marks on my right leg. But somehow I was alive, and the creature was nowhere to be seen. When I made it back to the house, I found coarse, dark animal hair scattered across my pillow and bedsheets. The hair didn't match any livestock I owned or any wild animal I could identify. It was thick and wiry, with an oily texture that left stains on whatever it touched. Since that night, I haven't lost a single head of cattle to the creature. Whatever it was seems to have disappeared as completely as it had appeared. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that my encounter with it changed something fundamental about me. I can't sleep through the night anymore. I wake up constantly with the taste of raw meat in my mouth, even though I've become increasingly unable to stomach eating beef. The scratches on my shoulder healed, but they left scars that sometimes ache when storms are approaching, as if they're connected to something beyond normal weather patterns. Most disturbing is a persistent doubt that haunts me every day. When I try to remember exactly what happened in that barn, the details become fuzzy and contradictory. Sometimes I remember being the victim, fighting for my life against a monster. But other times, I have flashes of memory that don't make sense, images of running through the darkness on 4 legs, of the taste of fresh blood, of seeing the world through yellow eyes that aren't my own. I've started avoiding mirrors when possible, because sometimes my reflection seems slightly off. My teeth look sharper than they should, My eyes appear more yellow than brown in certain light. And when I'm working outside during the full moon, I catch myself sniffing the air like an animal tracking scent. The most terrifying question isn't what that creature was or where it came from. The question that keeps me awake at night is this: when I encountered it in that barn, was I the prey it was hunting, or was I somehow becoming part of what it was? Because deep down, I'm starting to suspect that the creature didn't disappear at all. I think it's still here, closer than I ever imagined possible. This old farmhouse belonged to my wife's grandmother, who passed away about 3 years ago. Since she didn't have any other family besides my wife, we inherited the property when the estate was settled. It's a beautiful place, a classic Victorian farmhouse with tall ceilings, thick brick walls, and enough character to fill a dozen decorating magazines. The property sits on about 15 acres in rural Virginia, with mature oak trees, a creek running through the back section, and gardens that the grandmother had maintained for decades. When the rent on our apartment in Richmond became too expensive, we decided to move out here and restore the house to its former glory. Most of the house was in decent condition, but the kitchen needed serious attention. It was one of those large, old-fashioned kitchens with a massive wood-burning stove and deep farmhouse sinks. The grandmother had complained for years that the plaster walls were deteriorating and needed to be completely redone. I hired a local contractor named Eddie Morrison, who had worked on several historic properties in the area. Eddie was familiar with the house. He'd done some minor repairs for the grandmother over the years. He explained that to properly renovate the kitchen, we'd need to strip all the old plaster down to the original brick and start fresh. The project began on a Tuesday in late September. I took time off work to help with the demolition, figuring I could learn something and maybe save some money on labor costs. We started with hammers and pry bars, carefully removing decades of wallpaper, paint, and plaster from the walls. It was on the second day that we made the first discovery. When we stripped the plaster from the wall behind the old stove, we found something that made us both stop working and stare. Pressed into the soft clay mortar between the bricks were dozens of handprints, clear impressions, as if people had pushed their palms against the surface while it was still wet. The prints varied dramatically in size. Some were obviously from small children, others from adults, and a few that seemed too large to be from normal-sized people. But what was most disturbing was their positioning. Every single handprint was oriented as if the person had been facing the wall, palms pressed against it, as if they were trying to push through, or perhaps bracing themselves against something. Eddie had been doing renovation work for over 20 years and said he'd never seen anything like it. The preservation of the prints was remarkable. You could see individual fingerprints and palm lines in many of them. Some appeared frantic, with fingers spread wide and deep impressions, suggesting the person had pressed with considerable force. As we continued removing plaster from other walls, we found more handprints. The wall where the kitchen table had always sat contained at least 60 prints of various sizes. Many were overlapping, as if multiple people had been pressed against the same area simultaneously. Some of the smaller prints were positioned far too high for a child to reach naturally, as if they had been lifted up or were somehow floating when the impressions were made. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd found. My wife suggested it might be some old building technique, or perhaps children playing in wet mortar during the original construction. But something about the desperate nature of the impressions bothered me deeply. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by a gentle but persistent tapping sound coming from the kitchen. It was rhythmic and soft, like someone lightly knocking on the walls from the inside. I lay in bed listening for several minutes, trying to convince myself it was just the old house settling or perhaps mice in the walls. The tapping continued for about an hour, moving around the kitchen in a pattern I couldn't understand. Sometimes it seemed to come from the wall we'd been working on, other times from the opposite side of the room. Eventually, I decided to investigate. When I reached the kitchen, the tapping stopped immediately. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, listening to the complete silence, then checked the walls we'd exposed. Nothing seemed different, but I could swear the room felt colder than the rest of the house. The next night, the sounds returned, but this time they were accompanied by something that made my blood run cold. Along with the tapping, I could hear what sounded like children's laughter, but muffled and distant, as if it was coming from somewhere far away or from inside the walls themselves. My wife heard it too this time. She grabbed my arm and whispered that it sounded like kids playing hide-and-seek, their giggles echoing from impossible spaces. The laughter had a hollow quality that made it seem both joyful and somehow wrong at the same time. On the third morning, I walked into the kitchen to make coffee and found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about our house. All the dishes I'd left in the sink the night before had been moved to the kitchen table and arranged in 6 neat stacks. Each stack contained 4 or 5 plates, and they were positioned in a perfect line across the center of the table. What made it even more disturbing was that each stack had a small glass placed upside down on top, like tiny tombstones marking each pile. When Eddie arrived that morning and saw the arrangement, his face went pale. He asked if my wife's grandmother had ever told me any stories about the kitchen, but when I pressed him for details, he became evasive. All he would say was that maybe we should leave the walls as they were, that sometimes old houses had reasons for keeping their secrets buried. Since then, we haven't been able to use the kitchen normally. Every time we try to cook in there, utensils move on their own, pots rattle on the stove even when they're empty, and there's always that smell like something burning that you can never quite locate. The tapping in the walls has become a nightly occurrence, sometimes so loud it sounds like someone pounding with their fists, and the handprints seem to be changing. I swear some of them appear to shift slightly when I'm not looking directly at them, as if the hands are still moving, still trying to break through. We've moved all our cooking outside to a makeshift setup on the back porch. The kitchen sits abandoned now, with those dozens of handprints exposed on the walls like evidence of some tragedy I'm afraid to understand. I've thought about covering them back up with new plaster, but something stops me every time I consider it. Maybe it's respect for whatever happened there, or maybe it's fear of what might happen if we trap those hands behind the walls again. Sometimes, late at night when the tapping is particularly loud, I wonder if covering those prints the first time was a mistake. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever left those impressions is still trying to get out. I'd always dreamed of owning my own piece of land, So when this property came up for sale in rural Oregon at a price I could actually afford, I jumped at the chance. The place was somewhat isolated, about 8 miles from the nearest town on a winding dirt road that only saw the mail truck twice a week. But that's exactly what I was looking for. Peace, quiet, and space to breathe. The previous owner was an elderly man who said he was selling because he wanted to move closer to his children in Portland. The property wasn't large, maybe 5 acres total, but it had a modest 3-room house, plenty of mature trees, a hand-dug well, and enough open space for me to start a garden and maybe keep some chickens. I moved in on a Thursday in early March and spent the first week getting familiar with every corner of my new home. I was excited about the possibilities, planning where to plant vegetables, considering the best location for a chicken coop, and generally feeling like I'd finally found the place where I belonged. On my 4th morning there, I discovered something that puzzled me. Right in the center of the front yard was a hole that definitely hadn't been there the day before. It was perfectly round, about 3 feet across, and deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom even when I got on my hands and knees to peer into it. The excavated dirt was piled neatly around the perimeter, as if someone had spent considerable time and effort digging with proper tools. My first thought was that it might be the work of some large animal, maybe a badger or even a bear looking for grubs or roots. I filled the hole with dirt from the surrounding piles, tamped it down firmly, and figured that was the end of it. The next morning, there were 2 holes. One was in the exact same spot I'd filled the previous day, and the other was near the property line. Both showed the same characteristics, perfectly round, very deep, with dirt methodically arranged around the edges. This was clearly not the work of any animal I knew about. I drove to the neighboring property to ask if they'd had similar problems. The neighbor, an old-timer named Carl who lived in the area for 30 years, got a strange look on his face when I described the holes. He told me the previous owner had complained about the same thing for years, but had never figured out what was causing it. Carl suggested I be careful, that some things are better left alone, but he wouldn't elaborate on what he meant by that. I decided to keep a closer watch on the property during daylight hours, but the holes only appeared overnight. Every morning brought 2 or 3 new excavations, always with the same precise characteristics. They seemed to be moving in a pattern across my land, starting from the back fence line and gradually working their way toward the house. After a week of filling holes only to find new ones the next day, I decided to stay up and catch whatever was doing this. I set up a lawn chair on the front porch where I could see most of the yard, and settled in for a long night of surveillance. For hours, nothing happened. I had a good view of the entire area, and except for the occasional owl or bat, everything was perfectly quiet. I was beginning to think that maybe my presence was deterring whatever had been digging when I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It was coming from behind the house, a dry, scraping noise like someone dragging a heavy branch across the ground. But the rhythm was wrong for wind-moving debris. It was too regular, too purposeful. I got up quietly and made my way around the house toward the sound. What I saw in my backyard challenged everything I thought I understood about reality. There was a man there, but not like any man I'd ever seen. He was completely naked, painfully thin, and covered from head to toe in dirt and clay. He was on his hands and knees, digging with his bare hands with the intensity and speed of a machine. His fingernails had grown long and were caked with soil, and he excavated earth with a technique that suggested he'd been doing this for a very long time. But the most disturbing aspect was that he was talking to himself as he worked, in a voice that sounded like he hadn't used it in years, cracked and hoarse. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "Haven't found it yet, but I will soon. Haven't found it yet, but I will soon." I stood frozen, watching this bizarre scene unfold. The man, if that's what he was, dug with supernatural efficiency, throwing dirt behind him in perfect arcs that formed neat piles without him even looking. He never seemed to tire or slow down. When I finally worked up the courage to take a step closer to get a better look, I felt my foot sink into the ground as if I was stepping into quicksand. The more I struggled to free myself, the deeper I sank. Panic set in as I realized the solid earth I'd been standing on moments before had somehow become liquid. I called out for help, but the digging man didn't even acknowledge my presence. He continued his work and his chanting while I sank up to my waist in what had been firm ground. The sensation was terrifying, like being swallowed by the earth itself. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was sinking up to my chest and feeling the dirt closing over my head. I woke up in my own bed the next afternoon, disoriented and with a pounding headache. At first, I thought the whole experience had been an incredibly vivid nightmare. But when I looked at my feet, they were caked with the same clay-like soil I'd seen the strange man digging in. When I went outside to check the yard, there were 7 new holes, including one massive excavation exactly where I remembered sinking into the ground. Since that night, I wake up every morning with dirty feet, even though I always shower before bed. And every morning, there are new holes in my yard. They're getting closer to the house with each passing day. What started as random excavations near the back fence has become a systematic approach toward my front door. I'm terrified that one morning I'll wake up to find a hole dug right up to my doorstep, or worse, discover that the digging has moved inside the house itself. Sometimes I lie awake at night and swear I can hear that scraping sound and that hoarse voice chanting somewhere beneath my floorboards. Whatever that man is looking for, he's convinced it's here on my property. And I'm beginning to fear that one night he's going to find it. I bought this farmhouse in rural New Hampshire because the price seemed too good to be true. The real estate agent explained that the previous owner had moved to the city suddenly and wanted to sell quickly. The house is a classic New England colonial white clapboard siding, black shutters, and a wraparound porch that overlooks rolling hills dotted with old maple trees. The property includes about 12 acres, most of it wooded, with a small orchard and vegetable garden that had been well maintained until recently. What drew me to the place was its isolation. The nearest neighbor is almost 2 miles away, and you can't see another house from any window. The house has 4 bedrooms, and I decided to use the back bedroom as a guest room since it was larger than the others. There was something odd about the room's layout, though. It had a large window that faced directly into what appeared to be a steep embankment of earth and rock, as if the house had been built too close to a hillside. I thought it was strange architectural planning. Usually windows are positioned to take advantage of views or natural light, but this one opened onto essentially a wall of dirt and stone about 3 feet from the glass. It made the room perpetually dark, even during the brightest part of the day. I considered hiring someone to relocate the window, or maybe excavate the hillside to create some breathing room. But since I wasn't using the room regularly, I put the project on the back burner. It was on a Tuesday evening in October that I first noticed something wasn't right. I was walking past the guest room when I saw light coming from underneath the door. Thinking I'd left a lamp on, I went to turn it off, but when I opened the door, all the lights were off. The illumination was coming from the window, which made no sense since there should have been nothing but dirt and rocks on the other side. I approached the window cautiously and looked out. Instead of the embankment I expected to see, there was a complete scene that seemed to exist in its own pocket of reality. I was looking into what appeared to be a cozy kitchen in a small farmhouse. A woman in a blue floral dress was standing at an old-fashioned stove, stirring something in a large pot. She was holding a baby in her other arm, bouncing it gently while she cooked. The kitchen was warm and inviting copper pots hanging from hooks, herbs drying on the windowsill. A tabby cat curled up on a wooden chair. But what made my blood run cold was that both the woman and the baby were looking directly at me. Not just glancing in my direction, but staring with the kind of focused attention that made it clear they knew I was there. The woman's expression was neither friendly nor hostile, just intensely aware. I could see incredible detail through that impossible window. The kitchen had a large clock on the wall that read 8:43. There were wildflowers in a mason jar on the table. The baby was wearing a tiny yellow sweater with what looked like hand-knitted buttons. I blinked hard several times, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the scene remained vivid and real. I even pressed my hand against the glass to see if the woman would react. She continued stirring her pot and rocking the baby, but her gaze never left my face. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, everything vanished. The view returned to the familiar wall of earth and stone, leaving me staring at darkness. I stood there for another 20 minutes, waiting to see if the vision would return, but nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been some kind of optical illusion, maybe a reflection from somewhere else in the house, or my tired brain creating images from the interplay of shadows and limited light. But the next evening at exactly 8:43, it happened again. The same kitchen, the same woman in the blue dress, the same baby, even the same cat in the same position on the chair. Everything was identical except for one detail. This time, there was a loaf of bread cooling on the counter that hadn't been there the night before. This pattern continued every night. At precisely 8:43, the window would become a portal into this impossible kitchen, and I would watch the same domestic scene play out with tiny variations. Sometimes the woman would be washing dishes instead of cooking. Sometimes the baby would be sleeping in a small cradle beside the stove. But the woman and child always looked directly at me with that same unwavering attention. I started marking these occurrences on my calendar and timing them with my watch. The precision was unsettling, never 8:42 or 8:44, always exactly 8:43. What disturbs me most is that even when I can't see into the kitchen, I can smell it. Every evening around that time, The guest room fills with the aroma of strong coffee brewing and bread baking in a wood-fired oven. It's so realistic that my mouth waters, and I find myself craving comfort food I haven't thought about in years. I've tried to research the history of my property, but the records only go back to the 1940s, and they don't mention any other structures in the area. I've hiked around the back of the house multiple times, checking to see if there's any house positioned where that kitchen should be. There's nothing, just forest extending for miles. The window has started making sounds at night, even when I can't see the kitchen. I hear what sounds like someone gently tapping on the glass from the other side, and sometimes a soft scratching noise, as if fingernails are being drawn across the surface. I've considered boarding up the window, but every time I gather the tools to do it, something stops me. I'll suddenly remember an urgent task that needs to be done, or I'll misplace the hammer, or I'll simply lose the motivation to complete the job. The coffee smell has become stronger and more persistent. Now it fills the room every day at 8:43, whether I can see the kitchen or not. And lately, I've been hearing what sounds like a baby crying softly from somewhere beyond the glass, even on the nights when the window shows only darkness. I've stopped using that room entirely. I keep the door closed and try to pretend that part of the house doesn't exist. But the smell of coffee and the sound of that baby crying seem to be seeping through the walls, reminding me that whatever exists on the other side of that window is still there, still waiting, still watching. When my great-aunt Alina passed away last year, someone in the family had to take care of her estate. She'd lived alone for decades in a Victorian farmhouse about 30 miles outside of Salem, Massachusetts, making her living as a seamstress specializing in wedding dresses and christening gowns. Since I was going through a rough financial patch and needed a place to live, I volunteered to move in and maintain the property. The family was relieved that someone was willing to take on the responsibility. Aunt Alina had always been the eccentric relative, never married, kept to herself, and had some peculiar habits that made people uncomfortable. But she was an incredibly skilled seamstress, and her work was sought after by families throughout New England. When I arrived at the house, it felt like she just stepped out to run errands and would be back any moment. Her sewing machine was still set up at the large table in the front parlor, with a half-finished blue silk dress draped across it. Spools of thread in every imaginable color were scattered across the work surface, needles stuck in a small red cushion, and measuring tape coiled on the windowsill. The most striking feature of her sewing room was an enormous oval mirror, with an ornate gold frame that dominated one entire wall. It was the kind of antique mirror you'd expect to see in a mansion or museum, clearly valuable and probably dating back to the 1800s. The silvering was slightly clouded with age, giving it a dreamy, ethereal quality. According to my mother, that mirror had been off-limits to everyone in the family for as long as anyone could remember. Aunt Alina never allowed visitors into her sewing room, and she'd become agitated if anyone even mentioned the mirror. The family assumed it was just another one of her quirks. For the first week, I spent my time organizing her belongings and trying to decide what to keep, donate, or sell. The sewing supplies alone could stock a small shop. She had fabrics dating back decades, some of them clearly expensive silks and laces that were probably worth more than my car. It was while I was sorting through boxes of patterns that I first noticed something strange about the mirror. I was brushing my teeth in the small bathroom adjacent to the sewing room when I glanced at the mirror above the sink. Instead of my own reflection, I saw the face of a young woman I didn't recognize. She had Aunt Eleanor's distinctive bone structure and gray eyes, but she was probably in her 20s, with auburn hair styled in the fashion of the 1940s. The young woman was smiling at me, but it wasn't a friendly expression. There was something mocking and superior in her gaze, as if she found my presence amusing in a way that wasn't entirely pleasant. I turned around quickly, thinking someone had somehow gotten into the house, but the sewing room was empty. When I looked back at the bathroom mirror, my own reflection had returned. Over the next few days, this began happening regularly with any reflective surface in the house. Whether it was the bathroom mirror, the dark television screen, or even the surface of water in a glass, I would see that same young woman instead of myself. She was always watching me with that slight, knowing smile, as if we were sharing some joke that only she understood. I tried covering the large mirror in the sewing room with a sheet, thinking it might be the source of whatever was happening. But every morning, I'd find the sheet neatly folded on Aunt Eleanor's bed, and the mirror would be uncovered again. One night, I decided to stay awake and see what was happening. I positioned myself in the hallway where I could observe the sewing room without being seen. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the soft rustle of fabric, as if someone was handling silk or satin. I peered around the doorframe and watched in amazement as the sheet began moving on its own. It wasn't being pulled or tugged. It was folding itself with the precision of an expert seamstress, creating perfect creases and corners before settling into a neat square on the floor. The next Friday evening, I was in the sewing room trying to inventory Aunt Eleanor's collection of buttons and ribbons when I made eye contact with the reflection in the large mirror. The young woman was there again, but this time she was different. Her expression was serious, almost stern, and she appeared to be trying to communicate something. I watched in fascination as her mouth moved in the reflection, clearly forming words, though I couldn't hear anything. She seemed frustrated that I wasn't understanding, and her gestures became more animated. That's when I felt it, a sharp, burning sensation across my throat, as if someone had drawn a thin wire tightly around my neck. The pain was immediate and intense, like being cut with a razor blade made of ice. I grabbed my throat instinctively, but there was no visible injury, no blood, nothing to explain the sensation. The pain lasted only a few seconds, but it left me shaken and gasping. When I looked back at the mirror, the young woman's reflection was gone. I ran from the room and didn't return for several hours. When I finally worked up the courage to go back, I could still feel a faint burning sensation around my throat, as if I was wearing an invisible necklace that was too tight. Since then, I've avoided spending much time in the sewing room, but the sensation returns every time I enter that space. It's as if invisible hands are working with invisible thread, creating some kind of noose or collar that only I can feel. I've started sleeping with my bedroom door locked, though I'm not sure what good it would do. Some nights, I wake up with my throat feeling raw and constricted, even though there's never any physical evidence of what's causing it. My mother keeps suggesting that I sell the house and move back to town, but something prevents me from leaving. Maybe it's financial necessity, or maybe it's something else. A feeling that I'm connected to this place in ways I don't fully understand. There are mornings when I wake up and find spools of thread arranged in patterns I didn't create, or discover that Aunt Aliner's sewing machine has been running during the night, though it's not plugged in. The half-finished blue dress seems to be progressing on its own, with new stitching appearing daily. But the most disturbing development is that I've begun to see my own reflection changing. Sometimes, when I catch sight of myself unexpectedly, I look younger, and my hair appears more auburn than brown. My eyes seem grayer, and my smile has that same mocking quality I first saw in the stranger's face. I'm beginning to wonder if that young woman in the mirror was ever a stranger at all. And I'm starting to fear that whatever happened to make Aunt Aliner so protective of that mirror is now happening to me. I was raised in the deep woods of northern Maine, where hunting isn't just a hobby, it's a way of life that goes back generations. My grandfather had hunted these forests. My father learned from him, and I grew up understanding that the wilderness demands respect. We weren't weekend warriors or trophy hunters. We hunted to put food on the table, and we followed rules that were older than any written law. My grandfather used to tell stories about the old spirits that watched over the forests. He called them by various names: woodland guardians, forest protectors, beings that kept the balance between humans and wildlife. According to him, these spirits would allow ethical hunting, but they punished those who killed for sport or took more than they needed. I always thought these were just stories meant to teach respect for nature. Growing up, I learned to track deer, identify animal signs, and handle firearms safely. My father taught me that every animal has a season and a purpose, that pregnant does should never be taken, and that we should never kill more than our family could use. For 15 years, I followed these principles religiously. I hunted mainly on weekends during the appropriate seasons, always brought home what I killed, and never took shots unless I was certain of a clean kill. I even had a ritual I'd learned from my grandfather. Before entering the deep woods, I'd leave a small offering of tobacco and say a prayer asking permission to hunt. The forest seemed to accept me. I was successful without being greedy, taking maybe 6 or 8 deer a year, along with the occasional rabbit or grouse. The animals appeared when I needed them, and I never had to go far from familiar trails to find game. But then I made a mistake that changed everything. It was a Saturday afternoon in late November, unseasonably warm for that time of year. I was heading home with a nice buck I'd taken that morning, enough venison to last my family through the winter. On the way back to my truck, I spotted a beautiful doe drinking from a stream about 60 yards away. She was perfect, large, healthy, and clearly a mature animal. Under normal circumstances, I would have watched her drink and then continued on my way. I already had what I needed. Taking her would have been wasteful, since I couldn't properly preserve that much meat at once. But something came over me in that moment. Maybe it was pride, or the desire to prove my skill, or just simple greed. Without thinking it through, I raised my rifle and took the shot. It was a perfect kill, one shot, clean and quick. But as soon as I walked up to the doe, I was overwhelmed with guilt. I had broken the most fundamental rule I'd been taught: never take more than you need. I'd killed a beautiful animal for no reason other than because I could. I tried to rationalize it. I could give the extra meat to neighbors or preserve it differently, but I knew I'd crossed a line. Still, what was done was done. I field dressed both animals and loaded them into my truck. My father knew immediately that something was wrong when I brought home 2 deer. He didn't say much, but his expression made it clear he was disappointed. That night at dinner, he mentioned that my grandfather would have been ashamed, and that the forest has ways of settling accounts with those who abuse its gifts. The first sign that something had changed came that very night. I went to bed feeling guilty, but trying to push the thoughts away. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up with excruciating pain across my chest, 4 parallel lines that felt like I'd been raked with bare claws. When I turned on the lights, I could see deep scratches that were bleeding slightly, as if something with very sharp talons had marked me while I slept. The wounds were precise and deep, forming perfect parallel lines from my left shoulder to my right ribs. There was nothing in my bedroom that could have caused such injuries, and I'd gone to bed wearing a t-shirt that showed no signs of being torn. Along with the pain came a smell that made my stomach turn, the acrid stench of burning vegetation, like someone had set fire to green wood and wet leaves. The odor was so strong it seemed to coat the inside of my nose and throat, making it difficult to breathe. The next morning, I discovered that my dog Rex was missing. He was a loyal German Shepherd mix who never wandered far from the house and always slept on the front porch. I searched the entire property and asked all the neighbors, but no one had seen him. After 2 days of looking, I heard familiar barking coming from the direction of the woods where I'd been hunting. I followed the sound and found Rex standing at the edge of a clearing. But when he saw me approaching, his behavior was completely different. Instead of running to greet me like he always did, Rex began growling and backing away. His hackles were raised, and his eyes had a wild, frightened look I'd never seen before. It was as if he no longer recognized me as his owner, as if I'd become something dangerous that he needed to avoid. I spent 20 minutes trying to coax him closer, speaking in the gentle voice he'd always responded to, but he wouldn't approach. Eventually, he turned and disappeared into the deep woods, moving like a wild animal that had never known human companionship. That was just the beginning of how my relationship with animals changed. The livestock on our small farm, chickens, pigs, and a few goats, began avoiding me completely. Animals that had been calm and friendly their entire lives would panic when I approached. My horse, who I'd ridden for years, started rearing and bucking whenever I tried to mount him. It was as if every animal could sense something different about me, something that marked me as a threat or predator to be feared. But the most devastating change was what happened to my hunting. Every animal I killed from that day forward spoiled before I could get it home, no matter how carefully I field dressed it or how short the trip back to my truck. Deer that should have provided weeks of good meat would be rotting and inedible by the time I reached the road, filling my truck with the stench of decay. I tried everything, different processing techniques, faster transportation, even bringing a cooler with ice into the woods. Nothing worked. The meat would always spoil in ways that defied logic, sometimes starting to decompose while the animal was still warm. After losing several expensive hunting licenses worth of spoiled game, I had to stop hunting entirely. Word got around the small community that something was wrong with my kills, and I became the subject of whispered conversations and suspicious looks. The old-timers in town said I'd been marked by the forest spirits, that I'd broken some sacred trust, and now carried a curse that all animals could smell. They claimed Rex had been changed, that his spirit had been swapped with some wild creature as punishment for what I'd done. The scratches on my chest never fully healed. They faded to scars, but they still ache when storms are coming, as if they're connected to changes in the natural world around me. Sometimes, especially during the full moon, they burn with the same intensity as that first night. I still see Rex occasionally, always at a distance, always watching me from the tree line. But he's different now, leaner, more feral, with eyes that reflect light like a nocturnal predator's. He's become part of the wild in a way that seems permanent and irreversible. The most disturbing part is that I've started to understand what my grandfather meant about the forest keeping its own accounts. The guilt I feel isn't just about breaking a rule. It's about disrupting something fundamental, some ancient agreement between humans and the natural world. I've tried making offerings, performing rituals of apology, even seeking out Native American elders who might understand what I've done wrong. But nothing has lifted the curse. Animals still flee from my presence, and the forest that once welcomed me now feels hostile and unwelcoming. Sometimes I wonder if what happened to Rex is eventually going to happen to me. If I'm slowly being transformed into something wild and predatory, cut off from human society, just as I've been cut off from the natural world. The worst part is the dreams. Almost every night, I dream that I'm running through the forest on 4 legs, hunting with pack instincts I never had as a human. I wake up with dirt under my fingernails and the taste of raw meat in my mouth, even though I haven't eaten anything since dinner. I've stopped going into the deep woods entirely, but the forest seems to be calling me back. On nights when the wind is strong and the moon is bright, I hear howling that might be Rex, or might be something else entirely. And I feel an almost overwhelming urge to answer that call, to run into the darkness and never return to the human world that no longer seems to have a place for me. Whatever I awakened in those woods that day, whatever ancient force I offended by taking more than I needed, it's still out there. And I'm beginning to think that my punishment is far from over. My name is Marcus, and I'm not really sure how to start this. Until recently, I was just a regular guy with a boring office job and barely enough time to think about old legends or folklore. But there's something I need to share, even if nobody believes me. 3 weeks ago, I found an old notebook hidden in the attic of my great-aunt's house in rural Oregon. She passed away late last year, and the family asked me to help clear out her belongings. It was one of those old farmhouses with creaking floorboards and the smell of damp wood that seems to seep into everything. The notebook was carefully hidden, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tucked inside a shoebox that had been shoved way back behind some old Christmas decorations. The cover was eaten away by time, stained with mildew, and the pages had turned yellow. But what made my blood run cold was the first sentence written on the inside cover. If you're reading this, then the box has been opened. Now it might be too late. I thought about throwing it away, I swear I did. But there was something about that notebook, the shaky handwriting, the way the words seemed almost whispered on the page. I read it. I read every single word. And ever since then, things have been happening here. sounds in the middle of the night, my gate swinging open by itself, and yesterday someone scratched 3 letters into my car window. PAI. I'm sharing what's written in this notebook because if what this person wrote is true, then there's a story that was buried alive, literally. I thought about stopping here, really I did, but I've already started, haven't I? And what's written in this notebook can't stay hidden anymore. It's as if whoever wrote this left everything documented for someone to discover someday. And now, I'm the one holding it. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I read. I won't make anything up. I've just updated some of the old-fashioned words to make them easier to understand. But the story is exactly as it was written, word for word. Here's the account. If you found this notebook, I'm sorry. I should have burned it, but I didn't have the courage. I kept thinking that if I wrote everything down, maybe things would stop, or at least stay away from me. The Pava family lived out at the end of Deer Creek Road, past the old covered bridge. We grew up hearing that their farm was different, that there was something wrong out there, even though nobody could explain exactly what. The woods around their place were thicker, the air heavier, and the silence was a silence that didn't feel natural. Old man Pava was too serious for his own good. Mrs. Azira was always muttering prayers under her breath or mixing herbs over the stove. And their children never smiled, not when they were little, not later either. They always had this strange way about them, staring at things like they could see more than the rest of us. But the strangest thing was the smell. It started on a Sunday. The wind shifted and brought this weird odor from the direction of their farm. It was sweet but nauseating at the same time, like rotting fruit mixed with smoke. And the worst part was how it stuck in your throat, lingered for days. A lot of people smelled it, but nobody wanted to talk about it. Out here in the country, folks learn early that there are some things you're better off not poking at. Then the animals started disappearing. First it was chickens, then dogs. And it wasn't just disappearances. Some of them turned up again, but in the worst possible way. I saw one that was missing its legs. Another one showed up with its eyes sewn shut with thick thread, the kind they use for grain sacks. I know it sounds crazy, but I saw it. I remember my grandmother making the sign of the cross and telling us never to speak of it again. And the worst was still to come. Little Ivy Thompson disappeared. Her father says she never came home from school. There was a woman who lives near the main road who swore she saw the girl standing at the edge of the woods, looking in like someone had called to her, like she was listening to something. But here's the detail nobody likes to remember. Nobody went looking for her. Not the police, nobody. They went to the fence, looked inside, and turned back, and they never mentioned it again. Ivy became just another name that nobody talks about. That's when people started whispering. They began saying it was the Pava's fault, that they were messing with dark things, that what lived out there with them wasn't human anymore, and hadn't been for a long time. The strangest part was when the nightmare started. Lots of children began waking up screaming in the middle of the night, always saying the same thing, that there was a woman at the window, a woman with a headscarf, standing there staring without blinking, without saying anything, just standing there, solid as stone. The detail that made my blood freeze was that all the children described the same face with the same stare, and none of them had ever seen Mrs. Azira up close. One day, a boy from the upper part of town fainted in class. When he woke up, he started hitting everyone, saying that the blood was going to rise through the woods, those exact words. The teacher swore he was speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. His parents took him away 2 days later. They never came back. Then came the whispers at Sunday service, the sideways glances at the general store. People saying the Pavas had made some kind of pact, that what lived out there with them hadn't been human for a long time. The worst part was when the pastor from the little church in town started preaching against them right there in the town square, shouting into a microphone that God would bring justice with the help of anyone brave enough, that the town needed to purify itself. And people started listening. The strange thing is that nobody talked about it at home. It was like families knew it was dangerous to discuss out loud. But in the streets, in corners, in shadows, the plan was already growing. And the worst part was that it seemed like everyone was just waiting for someone to start. They just needed a push that came faster than it should have. The most bizarre thing is that when it all really happened, nobody was shocked. It was like everyone had been expecting it to happen sooner or later. And I keep wondering how things got to that point without anyone trying to stop it. It all started on a Sunday, always Sunday. The pastor called a special vigil, men only. I remember my father leaving the house with a piece of wood in his hand, telling my mother, "Tonight we settle this." And the strangest thing is that she didn't argue. She just stood in the doorway, holding her rosary beads with tears in her eyes, like she knew something was going to be broken that night. The crowd left the square around 8 o'clock. I didn't see everything because my mother locked me inside the house, but I could hear the sound of footsteps, muffled shouts, the sound of earth being trampled hard. And the worst part was the silence afterward, a silence that lasted almost an hour, like time itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound, people screaming, glass breaking, and one voice, just one, screaming someone's name. I don't know whose name, I just remember the tone sounded like someone being pulled down or dragged inside. It was a scream that wasn't pain, it was pure desperation, like the person knew they weren't getting out of there. The police showed up, but not the way we expected. They didn't break anyone up, didn't send anyone home. They just surrounded the place and let the crowd go in. The strangest thing is that nobody was arrested. They said the Pavas were taken for questioning, that they'd confessed everything, that they worshipped the devil, used animal blood to make pacts, that little Ivy was offered as a sacrifice. But nobody saw this confession. No papers, no recordings, nothing. And the worst part is that there was never a trial, just disappearance. One day they were there, the next day nothing. The house was burned, they dug a mass grave in the pasture, and that was it. Done. But there's one detail nobody can explain to this day. The ground where they buried the family never grew grass again. The strangest thing was that after everything, nobody celebrated. Nobody set off fireworks, nothing like that. The mood in town got weird, kind of stuck, you know. It was like everyone realized they might have gone too far, but it was too late to go back. The Pavas' house stayed there on the hill with the windows open, and everything inside still in place. Only the smell had changed, a strong smell of burning, but kind of sweet, that hung in the air even in the middle of the night. They said they were going to burn it down soon to cleanse the land, but they waited 3 days. 3 days, and in that time, something happened that nobody can explain to this day. On the second night, someone swore they saw people walking around inside the house, but the Pavas had already been buried. The person who told this story was well known, not one to make things up. He said he saw a woman standing in the doorway with a cloth on her head, holding a bowl with something black inside. She didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there. And the strangest part was that according to him, the woman was wet, like she'd just come out of the river. The house was burned the next day, early in the morning. They gathered some men, poured kerosene on everything, and set it on fire. The fire caught fast, went up quick, but there was one detail that made me sick. The shed in the back, a kind of barn they used to store old things, didn't burn. Even with the fire getting close, even with the wood being old and dry, it stayed standing. And nobody wanted to go near it afterward. They said the energy there was different, that the smoke would come and stop at the shed like it was hitting an invisible wall. The most bizarre thing is that a few days later, a kid from town found something nearby. A notebook wrapped in thick cloth and buried only halfway down at the base of a dead tree. And the cloth was wet, even with the heat being almost 100 degrees. I'm almost certain it was this same notebook that I found now, decades later, in my great-aunt's house. The question is, how did this notebook get from there to here? The strangest thing is that ever since I started reading this notebook, things here at home have started getting different. And it's not exaggeration, it's not paranoia. I'm talking about things you can see, hear, feel. On the first day, it was just a slight discomfort, a weird feeling that someone was behind me every time I turned around. But I thought, okay, I'm scared, that makes sense. But then on the second night, I woke up to the sound of my gate opening. But I live alone. I got up slowly, went to the living room window and looked out at the street. There was nothing there, but the gate latch was undone. And I know I locked it. I always lock it. The truth is, the more I read, the more it seemed like something was paying attention. Like this notebook wasn't written just to be read, but to be continued. And the most bizarre thing is that on the last page I read yesterday, there was a sentence written in different handwriting, more recent, shakier, that wasn't there before. And it said just this: "You found me." I closed the notebook immediately. I felt my whole body shiver. I had to leave the house, spent some time in the car with the engine running, breathing slowly, looking in the rearview mirror like I was going to see someone there. And the worst part is that I felt like it wasn't the first time that sentence had been written. It sounds silly, but I'm starting to think this notebook changes as you read it, like it knows who's reading, and like the things written in it aren't just memories, but seeds. Seeds of something that never really left. The most bizarre thing is that I thought sending this account out would make things stop, like talking about it would lift the weight. But it's been the opposite. It's getting worse in a way I can't even explain properly. This morning when I woke up, there was dirt on my pillow. Dark, damp dirt with a strong smell. And my bedroom window was locked, the door too, and there's only me here. I cleaned everything up, but I had that on my mind all day. Then later, when I went to get some things from my car, there was a word written in the fogged-up glass, like when steam marks something that was there before. And it was there, Pava. I don't know if I'm going crazy, but there's something in this notebook that seems to be activating something. And the strange thing is that I tried to throw it away today, really tried. But ever since then, I've had a headache, a ringing in my ears like someone whispering from far away, but inside my head, and an overwhelming urge to keep reading, to finish telling everything until the end. The bizarre thing is that I'm remembering things I never lived through flashes of an old house. Someone calling me in the woods, a wet scarf around my neck. It's like what was buried there in '76 has woken up and is now trying to find a new voice. And I don't know if it's me, but I'm still writing. I'm still writing. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.